When shall we three meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurdy-burdy is done.
Character and Conflict, an Introduction to Drama by Alvin B. Kernan, read by Vincent Bagnall. Character in drama. When we see a play, our attention first focuses on character. We're interested in the people on the stage, and we want to know more about them. What moves them to act as they do? What happens to them? Why does it happen? Are they responsible? These are legitimate interests because a play is valuable only insofar as it tells us something about human nature and about the way the world goes for men. The characters are a dramatist's primary images of human nature. They are his statements in speech and gestures about the elusive creature man. The character Hamlet, for example, can be thought of as a dramatic proposition, similar to one philosopher's definition of man as a featherless biped, or to the economist's definition of human beings as consumers and producers of goods and services. Hamlet, featherless biped, consumers and producers, all are attempts to sum up, to find an adequate image for the essential quality of man. Obviously, however, the character Hamlet is more complex than these other definitions. A summary statement about him must take into account, for example, his sorrow over the death of his father and the lust of his mother, his disturbed preoccupation with change and death, his mysterious assumption of a suit of black clothes, his staging of a play, and finally, his killing of a king. Besides being too simple to encompass the complex actions and feelings of Hamlet, the philosophers' and economists' definitions are also too abstract, too general for the specific terms of the play. Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark, the lover, perhaps, of Ophelia, the son of Gertrude, the man who, as a child, was carried on the shoulders of Yorick, whose skull has been turned up by a gravedigger in making room for Ophelia's body. The degree of complexity and the amount of detail are not the only ways in which these definitions differ. The philosophers' and the economists' definitions fix man, place him in a static condition. No matter what happens, he'll always be two-footed and without feathers, always a user or producer of articles and work. But in drama, man is dynamic, a restless seeker of some particular end. The forces at work within him, his motives, drive him forward to do or to attempt to do some particular thing in the outer world, to achieve freedom, control nature, or create order and stability from chaos and change. If we are to understand a character in a play, we must think of him not as a static connection of qualities, a still portrait, but as a doer of something. Our aim as readers should not be the fine analysis of a fixed, unchanging character. It should be an attempt to discover the fundamental motive that finds expression in everything the character does. Because dramatists conceive of their characters as doers, or as attempters. Every detail of costume and figure, every movement and gesture, every statement on even the most trivial subjects is a partial expression of the basic motive of the character. As the play progresses, this motive, lightly sounded in the opening movements of the play, takes more obvious form in a major goal, such as to bring peace to Rome, to marry Juliet, or to become the master of the world. The immediate obvious goal the character seeks is not itself, however, to be thought of as his basic motive. It is only one of the ways he seeks the realization of his motive, one expression of some more fundamental desire that, in its less heroic forms, is common to all men. For example, Hamlet's obvious aim is to kill Claudius and fulfill the ghost's command, But this is only one expression of his deeper motive, which is to seek out and destroy the infection that is poisoning every area of life in Denmark: politics, marriage, religion, and friendship. This general motive, which is expressed in his aim to kill Claudius, is equally present, though muted, in most of Hamlet's words and actions. He is, for example, trying to pierce the surface of fair seeming and locate corruption when he asks Ophelia if she is honest, when he breaks through his mother's illusions and shows her the real meaning of her marriage to Claudius, when he stabs through the hangings and kills Polonius, or when he penetratingly remarks that man who seems the beauty of the world is no more than a quintessence of dust. As we perceive Hamlet's motive, he ceases to be merely a fictitious prince struggling in a dark castle to kill an ogre king, and becomes a representation of the characteristic human desire to locate and eradicate those elements in life that subvert our hopes and ideals. Hamlet does not have every common characteristic of man, such as the ability to produce and consume goods and services. But he does embody an enduring, fundamental, and troublesome human motive. Since a character's actions and speech express his motive, it follows that we must look carefully at all he says and does. The simplest scheme to follow in our discussion of the components of character will be to begin by looking at the visible elements of dramatic character: physical features, clothing, movements, and gestures. From there, we can move inward to consider other expressions of character, such as thought and language. This movement from the external to the internal should strike us as natural, for it approximates the manner in which we come to know not only characters in plays, but also people in actual life. In life, however, some details are irrelevant. It may be, for example, no indication of a person's character that he has a humpback or thin hair or is enormously fat. But in a play, these physical details express character. In Shakespeare's Richard III, the crook-backed Richard's motive is to twist and destroy. This motive is expressed as much in his deformed back as it is in the disorders he contrives in his family, his society, and his kingdom. Similarly, Hedda Gabler's thin hair and her desire to pull out another woman's luxurious hair mark her as a woman who not only lacks vitality, but also actively seeks the lifeless, a woman whose motive is to kill. Falstaff's great belly shows us that he wants to make the world all flesh, that he seeks a purely physical existence. To think of physical traits in this manner may at first require some readjustments, for nowadays we assume, or so we say, that a physical handicap is an accident. But in plays, though there are a few exceptions, physical features are usually expressions of motives, even such obvious physical attributes as youth and old age, beauty, ugliness, should be taken in this way. Juliet's extreme youth, she's only 13, and her startling beauty are properly understood as physical realizations of her inner innocence and harmony of being. While playwrights have always made use of the theory that the outer man expresses the inner one, they've often dramatized circumstances in which appearance and reality do not square, where, as Duncan says in Macbeth, there's no art to find the man's construction in the face. Oedipus's club foot shows us that for all his grandeur, king of Thebes and the greatest of living men, he is flawed. But no physical traits reveal that Iago in Othello is not the honest and trustworthy officer he seems, or that Claudius, the usurping king in Hamlet, is not the wise and efficient ruler he appears to be. Wherever physical appearance, actions, or words conceal rather than express directly the mind's construction, we have what is known as irony. The word has many shades of meaning, which we shall have cause to examine, but basically, irony is used to describe circumstances in which what seems to be, and what actually is, are in some way opposed. For example, where a devil seems to be a god, where death masquerades as life, or where slavery presents itself as freedom. The fact of irony complicates but does not invalidate our general point that physical appearance helps us understand the basic nature of a character. In the simplest kind of irony, there is a direct and obvious contradiction between appearance and reality, between body and mind. The contradiction sets up a contrast, and a contrast is almost as useful as a similarity in defining something. White may be defined by black as well as by other instances of white. The well-compact dimensions, the straight, powerful, handsome bodies of such hypocrites as Edmund in King Lear and Iago both conceal and reveal their twisted, ugly minds. The straightness of body defines, by contrast, the crookedness of mind. Irony complicates character in many ways by creating ambivalent or complex motives, but for the present, it is only necessary to remember that the physical attributes of a dramatic character are never mere accidents. They are symbols or indexes, direct or ironic, of his basic nature. Clothing, costume, also makes visible a character's motives. The realization of motive may be direct and obvious, as it is in Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire, where the bright primary colors worn by the men in the play express their brutal directness, their emotional simplicity, and their reduction of life to elemental appetites. Clothing may also express more subtle motives. In the same play, Blanche Dubois' longing to disguise the crude, painful facts of life is represented by the cosmetics. Makeup may be considered part of costume. Fake furs and costume jewelry with which she attempts to veil her loss of youth, money, and social prominence. Even less obvious uses of clothing may express character. Correct but unremarkable clothing may suggest, for example, that a character is proper, that his basic drive is to do the accepted thing. Since clothing often manifests the man, a change of clothing may signify a radical change in him. In King Lear, Lear first appears clad in rich robes and wearing a golden crown, secure and certain of his worth as a man and as a ruler. 2 acts later, on the stormy heath, when he comes to doubt his own value, his changed condition is reflected in his attempt to strip himself naked so that his outward appearance will conform to his newfound knowledge that man is no more than a poor, bare, forked animal. Clothing, like physical appearance, may also be employed in an ironic manner to reveal the distinction between what a man is and what he pretends to be. Blanche Dubois' cheap furs and Macbeth's kingly garments, which hang loose about him like a giant's robe upon a dwarfish thief, provide grim comments on the inadequacy of these characters to live up to their pretensions. The key to understanding the function of costume in the theater is to remember that dress is seldom decorative or realistic detail, but is an expression of the wearer's motives. Just as a character's motives are visible in his person and in his clothing, so his gestures and movements are an acting out of his motives. Care must be exercised to catch the meaning of deceptively simple and ordinary movements, such as pacing a room, breaking free from an embrace, turning away from a conversation, frequently withdrawing from the stage, or retiring to an isolated corner. Taken together, all these seemingly innocent actions may suggest that a character's primary motive is to remain unencumbered by human relationships, to be free and unattached. While every stage action in a well-written play, no matter how trivial, will help express motives, dramatists usually provide more obvious significant actions to manifest the primary drives of their characters. In Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, for example, everything passes away in time. Love, friendship, power, beauty, wealth, youth, all disintegrate. Caught up in this ceaseless change, the major character's motive is to create some kind of permanence, to hold together something that they value. They express this motive by their frequent attempts to hold something or to embrace something. Firm handshakes to seal bargains, tight embraces to bind love to love, buckling of the body into armor to preserve reputation and to hold the empire together. Romeo and Juliet insist, though they constantly fail, that they can be united in soul and mind, without concern for such earthly matters as body, family, civil disorders, or other practical concerns of life. Their suicides by poison and dagger are their final attempts to be rid of the body and earthly cares, and to be joined at last with one another in spirit in a triumphant grave. Of course, a subtle irony plays through this definitive act, because in rejecting, finally, their earthly part, the body, Romeo and Juliet may have thrown everything away and become no more than corpses. Spirit and body, the play seems to say, are inextricably intertwined. But in attempting to understand dramatic characters, we must focus first on what they try to do, not on what they succeed in doing. In the plays of Anton Chekhov, for example, the characters often have a simple aim: to go to Moscow, to buy a farm. They are, however, futile people who fail to achieve what they want. Chekhov illustrates their basic ineffectiveness by showing their consistent failure to achieve smaller aims as well. They stumble when they try to walk, bump into furniture, and knock things over when they try to move gracefully, fall down when they attempt to dance, and go to sleep when they intend to stay awake. To understand them, we must first see what they try to do, and then discover the way in which these motives combine with what they actually do to make up their total characters. The greatest dramatists use action in such a skillful fashion that stage movements often provide a summary of the entire play and an insight into the basic motives of all the major characters. In the duel between Hamlet and Laertes, which comes at the close of Hamlet, what appears to be a polite fencing match is in fact deadly serious. For Laertes' rapier is poisoned. The combatants occupy the foreground of the stage while Claudius stands waiting behind them with a cup of poison. To one side stand the queen and the courtiers, apparently without knowledge of what is actually taking place. And when the duel begins, Hamlet proves a far better fencer than he was thought to be. After Hamlet has hit Laertes several times, a scuffle occurs. The rapiers are dropped, and by chance Hamlet picks up the one with the poisoned tip. These actions are endlessly suggestive, but they obviously summarize in visual terms the principal activities of the major characters throughout the play. First of all, the weapons are fencing foils, and the rapid thrust and parry of these light, flexible swords duplicates the quick interplay of the minds of Claudius and Hamlet, as each has sought during the play to counter the attacks of the other and, in turn, to open his antagonist up for the fatal thrust. Obviously, a duel using battle axes or lances would not fit the situation here. Claudius' position behind Laertes restates his method of procedure throughout the play. He has never attacked Hamlet directly, but has always gotten at him through an agent. The Queen, Polonius, Ophelia, or Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. His major source of dupes has been Polonius and his family, and now he is using the last of them. Whenever Claudius has dealt with Hamlet, he has masked his true intentions behind a pretense of honest concern and fair dealing. His method is reflected in the pretense that the duel is no more than an honest exercise, a courtly game involving a small wager. But behind Claudius's pretenses of honesty, he has always been a poisoner. He has metaphorically poisoned the kingdom, and literally poisoned its king, and so the poisoned rapier and cup. The queen and courtiers innocently looking on, establish visually their simple-minded acceptance of all that has gone on in Elsinore, and demonstrate that the majority of men look but do not see. The chance exchange of rapiers and the deaths of Laertes, Gertrude, and Claudius condense into a few swift actions the role that fate has played in the drama, the inevitable deaths of the stupid and innocent, who stumble between the paths and fell-incensed points of mighty opposites and the frequent recoil of the invention on the inventor. Finally, Hamlet's death shows once again the cost of ridding the court of Claudius. Not many dramatists employ actions as effectively as Shakespeare does in Hamlet, but in most plays, action will tell us a great deal about character. Important as the visual language may be, playwrights seldom provide us with much physical description of the characters, nor do they often elaborate on costume and action. A few swift, strong strokes of the descriptive brush on a stage direction or in a speech make the necessary point. It is up to the reader or the producer to enlarge upon these hints. The reason for the brevity of description is that dramatists do not write to be read in a classroom or study. They write with the theater in mind. Actors, costumes, movement, scenery, placement, gesture, sound. The text of the completed play is thus a kind of musical score that does not finally exist as a play until it is produced on a stage. This does not mean that it is futile to read plays. It only means that we must read in a special way, that we must stage the play in our heads as we read, providing form and voice for the actor, costumes, makeup, scenery, and movement. We must read as if we were directors, placing the characters on stage for the maximum effect, directing them in their gestures and movements, providing the correct intonation for a given line, telling them what to do during awkward intervals when they remain on stage without lines to speak. Only by reading in this way can we hope to arrive at something approximating an ideal performance. Some readers, Charles Lamb is the most famous of them, have preferred never to go to the theater, insisting that a live performance can never match the magnificent acting and superb effects of the theater of the imagination. But a word of caution is necessary here. Reading the text of a play in this fashion is not an invitation to rewrite the play. We are not free to costume the characters in any fashion that appeals to us. Nor are we free to have them do anything that strikes our fancy. Costumes, action, and all other details of the production must be controlled by the play as we have it in the text. When the author does not provide specific directions, our theatrical editions must be material images of the fundamental ideas of the text. For example, while Shakespeare provides no directions about the physical appearance of Macbeth, it would clearly be inappropriate to make him short, thin, and supple. His brutal doggedness in battle, his determination to control the kingdom by any means once he has committed himself to this course, and the ponderous quality of his speech and mind dictate that he be powerful and heavy-set in body, slow and steady in movement, deep and peremptory in voice. Some historians of the theater have argued that drama began with miming, that is, the wordless acting out of ritual patterns. Many modern men of the theater have used this theory to argue that the play is essentially, as well as originally, a visual art that makes its statements about human nature and life primarily by means of costume, scenery, and action. No great play fails to make use of these and other forms of visual expression, but our greatest drama has always had a verbal dimension as well, and it is difficult to understand how characters could convey their intricate motives by their bodies, clothing, and actions alone. The visual and verbal elements of a play are not in opposition, rather they are complementary. Motives expressed in visual terms will be echoed and refined by language. Dramatic language works in the same way that stage movement works. The lines spoken by a character are not flat statements of fact or description. They are living language taught with effort. Bertolt Brecht, the German playwright, once described the nature of dramatic language, language that is action, by pointing out that this sentence, "Pluck out the eye that offends thee," is essentially still and undramatic. But the sentence, "If thine eye offend thee, pluck it out," is fully dramatic because it contains and compels an action. Brecht called this kind of language gestisch, or gestural. In other words, in dramatic speech, the speaker accomplishes or tries to accomplish with words what he also tries to accomplish with his hands and feet. Words, after all, can wound or destroy, as well as a knife, or nourish, as well as food. Making and breaking, forming and separating, soaring and falling, covering and uncovering, and other such actions take place constantly in dramatic language, even when no visual objects are handled or no physical action takes place. A character's physical actions provide us with rough estimates of his motive, but his language confirms these estimates and provides more delicate shadings of motive. Motive as expressed in language is most obvious in what we may call thought. This term refers to the ideas of a character, his expressed opinions on any subject, his general pronouncements, his statements of values. Most people express a good many random ideas in their conversation, and it is difficult to trace a simple pattern in their thought. But a playwright, working under very severe demands of economy, gives many of his characters only one central idea, one unchanging motive. This idea or motive will be expressed in a variety of ways and will appear in what the character says about such diverse subjects as the weather, foreign affairs, the latest novel, or the condition of the garden. The motive is obvious enough in the comic character, for example, who reduces every topic of conversation to food, or turns away to the subject of money. It is nearly as apparent in a character like Parson Manders in Ibsen's Ghosts, who in the course of the first act discusses a great many topics. Which of the latest books should be read? Are the artists living in Paris? Moral? Should a child be sent away from his family to school? Ought an orphanage be insured against fire? No matter what the subject, Manders' speech implies that the conventional and socially accepted ways of thinking should serve as a guide to conduct. This simple pattern of thought reveals Manders as a spokesman, almost a personification of propriety, a man whose rather undistinguished motive is to do what is generally thought to be correct. The thought patterns of more interesting characters than Manders are usually more difficult to establish, and it is more difficult, too, for the audience to determine by his language what a character like Cassius in Julius Caesar, for example, is trying to do. Cassius talks about whether or not the heavens have any effect on human destiny. He describes Caesar, he persuades Brutus to join a conspiracy, he argues about a battle plan, and he discusses the necessity of wringing taxes from captive provinces. But when we look closely at what he has to say on each of these points, we discover that his motive, while it is always half hidden and partially obscured, is in every case to manifest his belief that he is the master of his own destiny, that no other man or force is superior to him or controls him. In the attempt to understand a character, one of the first steps should always be to gather together all of his statements to see if a single idea runs through them. What thought or motive does he consistently voice? Since playwrights do not attempt to hide the nature of their characters, they will usually state their central idea succinctly and openly at some point in the play. Cassius's central motive is revealed perfectly in his famous lines. "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings." Because they lack variety and depth, characters like Parson Manders, who have only one simple value to which they return predictably, are known as type or flat characters. And this kind of character is found in all drama, but is the staple of comedy. For in the comic vision of life, character is not very diverse or complicated. Comic characters usually fall into well-known types: the young lover, the clever servant, the old merchant, the pedantic doctor. And these types mechanically and laughably seek their one goal: money, a particular young woman, food, or mischief. What happens to these characters in comedy is equally predictable. The young lovers overcome the obstacles of birth and fortune. The old merchant is cuckolded and robbed, and the world goes merrily on its way, not because the direction of events has been shaped very much by character, but simply because this is the way of the comic world. In tragedy, however, the major characters are usually more complex, for tragedy dramatizes the inner life of man with all its conflicts, its ambiguities, its cross-currents of value. Characters with conflicting motives who sustain internal struggles are often described as rounded or three-dimensional, meaning that they show some of the complexity that is believed to exist in actual men. But in the drama, the most complex character seldom embodies more than 2 or 3 conflicting values, though this conflict will be expressed in a variety of ways. Hamlet is the perfect example. To be or not to be. To act or to remain passive. To revenge his father or to let the opportunity go by. To love or not to love Ophelia. To accept the corruption of the world or to strike out at it. In tragedy, this conflict of thought may be realized in several ways. One way, the way used by Shakespeare in Hamlet, is for the character himself to be aware of the conflicts within him and to express his duality of motive directly. An equally common technique uses irony to create a character who's not self-aware, who's not conscious of the conflict within himself. He thinks that he's single-minded and that since he knows his own mind perfectly, he can move to assert his principal value in a direct and uncomplicated fashion. By the end of the play, at the point called the reversal, it becomes clear that the character is not what he thought he was, that his nature is dual, and that he has been moving in a direction contrary to what he supposed. Let us take, for example, the case of Brutus in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Brutus thinks of himself as a cool rationalist who approaches all problems, whether they be as trivial as where he placed a book he was reading, or as important as the decision to kill the prospective dictator Julius Caesar, in a purely objective manner. Yet the play makes clear that Brutus is moved, in part at least, by common human passions, such as pride, envy, fear, and hatred. Brutus remains throughout the play totally unaware of the division in his character, and he is unified, we might say, only in being consistently divided. Like most men, he acts at once rationally and passionately. In most tragic drama, man ever but slenderly knows himself, as Goneril says of her father in King Lear, and the motives of characters of this order are not easily understood. The dramatist uses language as precisely as he can to present these farther ranges of character where the irrational and the rational meet and where motives originate. Long before psychologists demonstrated the existence of the unconscious mind and its role in human speech, dramatists had created characters who said far more than they consciously knew they were saying, whose actions and words expressed aims and conflicts of which they were unaware. In examining dramatic language at this level, we must remember that a character's words are not to be thought of as mere signs that such and such a quality is present, as a flashing red light at a railroad crossing signals that a train is passing. Instead, dramatic language is used to act out on the verbal level as if the flashing red light expressed the nature of the train, a basic motive, or motives, if the character is complicated. R.P. Blackmore has used the term language as gesture to describe this type of speech. Furthermore, language used in this way not only expresses motive and verbalizes the characteristic gesture, but it also defines the quality of the gesture, whether it is direct or involved, quick or slow, optimistic or despairing. A few examples will make this point clear. A characteristic speech pattern may manifest motive. A character who habitually begins sentences bravely enough, but trails off without finishing his thought, because he realizes that no one is listening, has verbalized both his desire to accomplish some aim and his despair of achieving it in the face of the world's indifference. The repetition of stock phrases at crucial moments is a realization in words of an unoriginal and inflexible mind, a mind that does the same thing again and again. Long pauses or slow, involved speech express a hesitant and tangled mind. Quick, flowing lines express a mind moving rapidly and with assurance toward a goal. Carefully controlled rhythms of speech provide some of the most subtle and acute effects of this order. Macbeth's lines, "Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow," creeps in this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time. Make audible in the long, slow, dragging regular movements, coupled with the repetition of words, his sense that the one movement left in life for him is to creep through tedious sameness to a meaningless death. A character may also express his motives in his imagery, the general term for comparisons, metaphors, and similes. When Romeo sees Juliet in the Capulet garden, he compares her to brilliant things, to the sun, to a bright angel, to a rich treasure, and to the stars in all the heavens. All this, of course, is perfectly standard love imagery, but it nonetheless reveals that Romeo, like other lovers, is seeking and realizes his aspiration for a magical instant in language to reach and be one with the highest, the transcendent. Juliet is for him, for at least this one moment, not a flesh and blood woman, but the symbol of an unearthly ideal toward which he strains upward in his language, just as he strains upward with his body from the ground to the balcony on which Juliet stands. Metaphor may reveal an attempt to move in the reverse direction as well. Iago in Othello regularly compares men and women to animals. A black ram, a dog, a white ewe, a Barbary horse, a fly, and he reduces all human actions, such as love or friendship, to physical functions: disgorging, disrelishing, feeding, heeding, and tasting. His images express his constant wish to diminish life to no more than animal activity. In this last example, it becomes obvious that two strains of imagery, or image patterns, those of animals and of physical functions, combine to suggest the same motive. Ordinarily, a character uses a variety of images. In order to understand what motives he is expressing in them, we must look for the common aim implicit in each image. But images sometimes jar against one another. The imagery of a complex character will also be complex, for they will express his mixed motives. When Hamlet describes man as this quintessence of dust, his reverence for man and his wish to glorify him appear in quintessence, while his disdain, disgust, and repulsion for the flesh is carried by the word dust. Dramatists use imagery in a great many ways to express character, but the general rule holds that the images a character uses are expressions in language of either his basic motive or his unresolved conflict of motives. Patterns, rhythms, and images are but three components of style. A character's style, the way he puts things, is in each of its details an enunciation of his motives. Consider, for example, the following speech from Congreve's The Way of the World. Mirabell is explaining to a friend the ways he tried to gain the confidence of an old lady so that she would permit him to marry her ward. "I did as much as a man could with any reasonable conscience. I proceeded to the very last act of flattery with her, and was guilty of a song in her commendation. Nay, I got a friend to put her into a lampoon, and compliment her with the imputation of an affair with a young fellow, which I carried so far that I told her the malicious town took notice that she was grown fat of a sudden, and when she lay in of a dropsy, persuaded her she was reported to be in labor." Leaving aside its sprightly and irrelevant humor, the most impressive quality of the speech is its breathtaking speed, its swift, certain, unhesitating forward movement. Yet despite its steady advance, the lines are nicely balanced. Phrase is played off against phrase and sentence against sentence, so that the overall effect is one of both force and order. The diction, the choice of words, is adequate and precise without being ornate, and there are no figures of speech. The lines dramatize a perfectly functioning, naturally keen, powerful, realistic, and ordered mind. At the other end of the scale is a speech such as this. Come, come, you are malicious now, and would breed debates. Petulance, my friend, and a very honest fellow, and a very pretty fellow, and has a smattering faith and troth, a pretty deal of an odd sort of a small wit. Nay, I'll do him justice. I'm his friend, and I won't wrong him neither. And if he had any judgment in the world, he would not be altogether contemptible. These lines of Whitwood's, also from The Way of the World, progress, if at all slowly and haltingly, with painful breaks and hesitations. These lines of Whitwood's, also from The Way of the World, progress, if at all slowly and haltingly, with painful breaks and hesitations. They're filled with dead wood, with needless repetition that only darkens the sense of what Whitwood is trying to say. The diction is vague and imprecise. The several mild exclamations such as come, come, and faith and troth emphasize the painful slowness, the eddying drift, the lack of sense with which his mind is working. These few examples are not intended as a catalogue of the stylistic resources of the dramatist. They only suggest the kind of linguistic devices the dramatist may use to bring his characters to life. Grammar, figures of speech, and even so humble a device as punning tell a great deal about a character. And the dramatist who wishes to do so can use all of the stylistic techniques developed in rhetoric and poetry over the last 2,000 years. Dramatic speech, in all its details, does serve as gesture, and an understanding of a character must be based on a close examination of at least the main features of his style. In poetic drama, where the language seems stretched to its maximum expressiveness, style will, of course, be more complex and precise in what it says about a character, but good prose speech, while not as packed and taut as poetry, makes use of the same stylistic devices that poetry does. The difference between good poetry and good prose is one of degree, not of kind. Up to this point, we have considered only those ways in which a character expresses himself, but playwrights often throw oblique light on their dramatis persona by relating them to objects, places, and people outside themselves. An association with some prop, stage property, often suggests some deep-lying interest. Falstaff's fondness for a cup of sack reveals his concern for bodily pleasure. Does it also suggest that he prefers the pleasures of inebriation to the difficulties of looking steadily at reality? The unshaded, harsh electric light that hangs in the center of Stanley Kowalski's house in A Streetcar Named Desire is the physical image of his unblinking way of looking at people and things. Both the light and the man expose pretense and cruelly reveal the objective truth. Light and man are finally joined when Stanley thrusts the bare bulb into the face of a woman who has been pretending that she is younger than she is, to reveal every wrinkle, every sign of age in her painted face. Props used in this way are called symbols, and they should always be approached with a good deal of care. In the case of the bare light, for example, it should be noticed that it is an artificial light, a man-made way of looking at things. Stanley would be quite a different kind of person if he were identified with the sunlight, and if he used its light to reveal Blanche's age. A great deal may be revealed by a character's preference for a particular place. The nature of the place may establish his primary concerns. Willie Loman, in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, gives form to his fierce desire to grow something in the world. Sons, friends, dignity, reputation, by his frequent references to gardens, and by his return to a barren backyard garden to plant seeds in the middle of the night after his world has collapsed around him. Alceste in Molière's The Misanthrope gives symbolic statement to his desire for isolation and total self-dependence by his reiterated decision to leave the polite drawing room of Paris for the wilds of the desert. What one character says about another often provides crucial information, though it is wise to remember that such descriptions may be biased or incomplete. Claudius's statements about Hamlet's motives are revealing, but they scarcely tell the whole story. One character's comments on another character usually results in a double perspective. The first tells us something about the second, but he also tells us a good deal about the way he himself thinks. When Gertrude, for example, attributes her son's melancholy to the death of his father and to her o'erhasting marriage, she provides a partial and rather obvious insight into the character of Hamlet, but she reveals her own feelings of guilt as well. Minor characters frequently serve both as commentators and reflectors of forces at work within the major figures. The calm stoic Horatio, who stands so often silent behind Hamlet, makes visible the unruffled acceptance of a confused and evil world that Hamlet, in one part of his complicated being, himself longs to achieve. In Ibsen's Ghosts, Parson Manders is apparently a figure of the utmost respectability who argues that men should always accept traditional moral standards because they are right and because they lead ultimately to happiness. The grotesque figure of the carpenter Engstrand, whose oily platitudes about duty and right are simply obvious attempts to mask his greed and selfish interests, reflects Manders' character. Manders is not the conscious hypocrite that Engstrand is, but in all that he says and does, there is a concern for being well thought of by other people. It is this hidden, self-seeking part of his nature that is constantly reflected by the parody figure of Engstrand. The identification is ultimately objectified when, after Engstrand has done Manders a favor, they shake hands, and Manders says with great feeling that from this time they will travel together. Formal relationships, such as the partnership of Engstrand and Manders, usually provide significant clues to the characters involved. In family relationships, blood kinship frequently represents metaphorically a more essential kinship of nature. King Lear has 3 daughters, 2 of them evil, grasping materialists, the other the soul of kindness and love. While each daughter remains a character in her own right, at the same time she personifies some of Lear's attitudes and values. The daughters act out for us, somewhat in the manner of an allegorical play, the struggle that is going on in Lear's mind between the forces of good and evil, and their words and actions reveal the full meaning of certain choices that Lear makes. All relationships between master and servant, king and subject, husband and wife, father and child, sister and brother, friend and friend, should be examined closely. They are used by the dramatist to reveal the nature of the characters involved. In a play, even more than in life, a man is known by the company he keeps. Since playwrights make their points by contrast as well as by similarity, a play will often contain characters whose radically different natures help to define one another. Iago's hatred for man and his attempts to destroy everyone around him are more distinct and more meaningful because he appears in the same play with Desdemona, whose nature it is to love and to be concerned for the welfare of everyone. The stark, brutal realism of Stanley Kowalski in A Streetcar Named Desire is set off by the vague, fumbling romanticism of Blanche Dubois. The practical vision of Oedipus stands in direct contrast to the spiritual vision of the prophet Tiresias. The latter contrast is reinforced by the ironic fact that Tiresias is literally blind, while Oedipus's physical vision is excellent. Here then are a few of the techniques playwrights have used to construct dramatic characters. It will be useful at this point to sum up the general principles that have emerged from our discussion. First of all, let us consider the status of a character in a play. Dramatic characters such as Oedipus, Falstaff, or Hamlet often seem more real, more vital, more essentially alive than do most of the people one meets. That a fictional character should seem more alive than a human being is a paradoxical result of the great dramatist's ability to concentrate and sustain in his characters those qualities that we consider the essence of life. Perfect expression of self in language and action, fullness of thought, intensity of feelings, and relentless movement toward the realization of basic goals. The genuineness of the more interesting dramatic characters is further established by the fact that they have about them an ultimate air of mystery. And here we arrive at one of the fundamental peculiarities of the dramatic form. In a novel or lyric poem, the author is free to tell us the true nature of a person. The springs of character can be laid open directly, but in the more traditional realistic or semi-realistic drama, there can be no such thing as absolute certainty about character. We see, as in life, only the outside of the person, hear what he says, watch what he does, listen to what others say about him, and we proceed from these phenomena to make informed guesses about what kind of person he finally is. We attempt to define the unknown and invisible principle of being from the known and visible, and we can do so with considerable certainty in the case of such simple characters as Macduff and Macbeth, Cassio and Othello, or Polonius and Hamlet. But the great figures of the stage, Oedipus, Lear, Hamlet, defy our efforts to pluck out the heart of their mystery, even when they speak directly to us of the currents of feeling that stir the bottoms of their souls. Their words manage to suggest areas of being and motives that cannot be directly stated, for which the character himself cannot find adequate language. But dramatic characters, for all their realness, are not finally living people. Complete human beings materialized on the stage by the magic of the playwright's words and the voice and body of the actor. Characters in drama are artistic constructions in which form, voice, and movement give life to the playwright's vision of human nature. Dramatic characters possess no qualities or attributes other than those the author provides them with, and we are not free to guess about the existence of other unstated qualities as we might be in trying to understand a real human being. For example, if a character in a play shows constant feelings of inferiority, we should not conjecture that in childhood he had dominating parents and a superior brother. He is an invented character, and as such he had no childhood except that which the playwright may have given him. There is no point in trying to imagine what a character does before the play opens or after it closes unless the author provides pertinent information. The distinction between what we may call the symbolic and realistic theories of dramatic character might seem to be critical hair-splitting without practical value for understanding a play. But it is in fact a crucial matter. If we approach the characters as real people, we risk taking the details of the play for granted and thus missing their meaning. Drama becomes for us a mere imitation of life, which intrigues us because, like the photograph, it duplicates reality. Using the realistic approach, we might conclude that King Lear has 3 daughters simply because he is a man who happens to have 3 daughters, and that Oedipus has a club foot simply because of an unfortunate childhood accident. This realistic approach, in which things are just because they are, leads to an uncritical acceptance of the play. Conversely, by taking the characters as real people, we may see too much at the same time that we understand too little. If we assume that characters are real people, or at any rate just like real people, it seems reasonable to explain them in the same way that we explain real people. Encountering a man like Macbeth in real life, we might conclude, if we were simple moralists, that here was a man who should have gone to church more regularly and read the Bible more carefully, or if we were psychologists, we might argue that here was a man who had been repressed by his father and therefore spent his life attempting to destroy authority and father figures, such as the king. Nothing of this, of course, is in Shakespeare's play. Macbeth kills the king because he, like other men, is ambitious to rise in the world and control others, rather than be controlled by them. He himself wants to be a king, and this motive is a given, a basic part of his nature, for which no explanation or cause is offered in the play. The drive to absolute power is, the play suggests, a standard part of man's will, one of the inexplicable facts of being. In providing moral or psychological interpretations that have no foundation in the play, we are substituting our own understanding of life for the very specific information that the play provides. If, on the other hand, we approach characters not as real people but as symbolic forms, like the images painters create, designed to present in a schematic fashion the basic and essential qualities of general human nature as the playwright perceives it, then our eye for detail and meaning is sharpened, and we are alert to the subtle portrayal of character presented. Our work as readers is to see all there is in the play, but no more. The second major point to be made is that dramatic character is coherent. Characters are made up of many different details: physical features, clothing, movements, opinions, statements, and ways of speaking. These details are not a random collection of unrelated fragments. Instead, each detail reinforces the others, gives expression in a different mode or on a different level to the same characteristic. As a result, a dramatic character is unified. What his clothes tell us about him in one way, his movements and his words will tell us in another way. This unity will be most apparent in a flat or type character. But even in the more complex characters who are divided within themselves and who seek opposing things, the same conflict is restated in all they do and say. In ironic situations in which the character is not what he seems to be, his duality will be implicit in everything that pertains to him. To understand a dramatic character, we therefore must always attempt to find the common denominator of his being, the unstated motive implicit in all the ways in which he expresses himself. And this brings us to the third main point. Drama, by its very nature, presents man as an actor, a doer of something, not a static, unchanging object. To understand a dramatic character, we must therefore think of him as dynamic, as always on the way to some goal, to the realization of some motive. Every aspect of him is an arrow, not pointed inward to a still center of consciousness, but shot outward toward a target. The character's appearance, movements, and language all attempt to achieve some fundamental aim, to know him, to comprehend the image of man that the playwright has constructed. We must discover what it is the character is always doing. Man is ultimately defined in drama as a reacher, we might say, a being who strives for something. All successful dramatists so portray him, though they differ in the aims and in the complexity of motives they build into their characters.
When the battle's lost and won, that will be ere set of sun. Where the place? Upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth.
Character and expressionistic drama. People don't do such things, Judge Brack exclaims after Hedda Gabler commits suicide. But people, of course, do do such things, and there's nothing in Hedda Gabler that could not occur in the real world. Ibsen's play is a masterpiece of the dramatic mode known as realism. Realism and realistic are tricky terms, which are apt to shift meaning from age to age or even from user to user. But for working purposes, we may define dramatic realism as the maintenance of an appearance of life as it is ordinarily experienced. In the realistic theater, characters seem to talk as people we know talk, to do the things we normally expect people will do, and to move about in the familiar world of other people, solid furniture and familiar settings. Realism is, of course, an illusion, because every dramatist, whether or not he preserves the appearance of reality, inevitably selects and shapes his material in order to construct not a photograph of the real world, but a revealing image of it. Art and life are not, finally, the same thing. In our earlier discussion of the ways in which a dramatist constructs a character, we considered only realistic techniques. In life as well as in a play, character may also be expressed indirectly by clothing, movement, thought, and style, though seldom as obviously, as precisely, as relentlessly, in short, as dramatically as in the theater. In life, perhaps only the genius and the insane man achieve that concentration of being and that economy of gesture which we find in dramatic characters. But every artist tries to express his ideas as fully as possible within his chosen form, and many playwrights have wanted to present the deeper layers of consciousness more directly than realistic drama techniques will allow. To do this, they have developed over the ages a number of devices for shifting the dramatic focus inward in order to portray motives as they take shape within the mind itself. Probably the simplest and most realistic device of this kind is the use of a confidant, a type of character whose sole function is to listen to the hero's frank explanation of his inmost thoughts. In the soliloquy, there no longer is a confidant present, and the hero, alone on stage, speaks as if he were thinking aloud, as Hamlet does, for example, in his famous to be or not to be speech. Another simple form of spoken private thought is the aside, a few words delivered by a character when several actors are present on the stage, but by convention heard only by the audience. Masks have also been used as a way of presenting man's deepest thoughts and feelings. They were used in the Greek and Roman theaters where, in addition to serving several practical functions, they probably portrayed the nature of the tragic or comic character wearing them, much as the demonic mask of the witch doctor expresses the nature of the forces with which he is working. In our own century, the American playwright Eugene O'Neill reintroduced masks in a number of plays in an attempt to dramatize those profound hidden conflicts of the mind, which the probings of psychology continue to disclose to us. In The Great God Brown, for example, the face of the chief character, Dion Anthony, is described as dark, spiritual, poetic, passionately supersensitive, helplessly unprotected in its childlike religious faith in life. But in order to protect himself from the world, he wears a mask with the expression of a mocking, reckless, defiant, gaily scoffing, and sensual young Pan. The face and the mask portray the two sides of Dion's character, his true personality and the one he creates in order to live in a world that has little use for such sensitive, trusting beings. The use of the mask not only permitted O'Neill to present basic complexities of character, but it also allowed him to dramatize the fact that most men make use of a public character, a mask that they show to the world. Another device, which has been extremely popular in recent years for staging the relatively inaccessible parts of the mind, is the flashback. Its function is to make visible the memories stored in man's mind, which are so crucial a part of his character. The flashback has been used frequently in the movies, a form well suited to handle it. The camera comes in closer and closer on a face as the face begins to dissolve into the scene the character is thinking of. The modern theater, too, has made good use of the flashback, despite the fact that it is technically somewhat more difficult to work on the stage than in the film. In Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, Willy Loman's intense preoccupation with his past and his continuing search among his memories for the point at which life began to go wrong is presented in a series of scenes in which the lights dim as his mind begins to wander from the present and come up again on a reenactment of some event 20 years past. One byproduct of the use of the flashback should be noted. Since the scenes from the past are as vivid and actual as the scenes of the present, we must conclude that past and present are equally real in the mind. Most dramatic techniques entail such secondary implications, and the skillful dramatist is aware of and utilizes every possible meaning inherent in his techniques. While such dramatic devices for revealing character as asides, flashbacks, and masks are unrealistic, the general term for them is expressionistic. Playwrights have frequently used them in plays that otherwise maintain the pretense of showing life as we ordinarily experience it. Some of these devices are by now so commonplace that they have become theatrical conventions and audiences accept them as realistic. When Hamlet steps out on stage and delivers a long soliloquy in blank verse in a play that is otherwise quite realistic, no one considers this any less lifelike than his speeches directed to other characters. In the West, realistic and expressionistic devices have usually been mixed, but some playwrights have been unwilling to accept this compromise. Instead, they have wanted to open up the human mind directly and concentrate on what goes on inside the head. There are a number of terms for this kind of dramatic writing: allegory, surrealism, morality play, expressionism, etc. But all refer to a type of play in which the pretense of realism has been largely or altogether abandoned in order to stage directly what goes on in the mind, without concern for whether these events in any way resemble the familiar world we perceive with our senses. In an allegorical play, the conflicting forces and desires at work within each man become the separate characters of the drama. The attributes of each, such as clothing, movement, and speech, reveal the nature of that particular component of the human psyche. Each has a motive that presses him toward some goal. The arguments and struggles between these characters act out man's mental conflicts. Everyman, the best-known English allegorical play, dramatizes the thoughts of man at the moment death seizes him. He at first refuses to believe what death, a character in the play, tells him. But as the dreadful truth is borne home, he begins to cast about for someone to help him, to accompany him on the long journey he must now undertake. Each of the values he has based his life upon, friendship, material wealth, beauty, etc., is personified, made into a character, and every man tests each in turn, only to be disappointed when each refuses to go into the grave with him. Finally, he discovers that only good deeds will accompany him, and good deeds is terribly weak because every man, like most men, has never taken very good care of him. Some of the characters of the allegory, such as fellowship and goods, may be thought of as having existence outside of every man's mind, but his examination of their worth within his own mind, not their separate existence, is dramatized. Probably allegorical plays of this kind can only be written at times when there is some accepted theory about the constituent parts of the mind and the way it works. No allegorical play dramatizing Freudian psychology has yet been written, but it is possible to imagine a modern everyman in which ego, by pointing out practical reasons for a particular course of action, tries to mediate between a raging, selfish id and a stern, puritanical superego, while pleasure principle is locked in a grim combat with death wish. In the modern expressionistic play, authors have not been certain enough of their theory of the mind to construct a complete dramatist persona out of mental characteristics. Instead, expressionistic dramatists have offered bizarre, unrealistic images of existence, not as it appears to the senses, and not as we ordinarily agree that it is, but as so they maintain we actually experience it within ourselves. For example, in one scene of George Kaiser's From Morn to Midnight, life is presented as a 7-day bicycle race in which a few active riders drive themselves to exhaustion to win fame and cash prizes, while the mass of people look on hoping that there will be a serious accident. This extended image is complicated in all of its details, but essentially it dramatizes in the round and round of the race the repetitive sameness of life and the sense of futility involved in going faster and faster to get to the same place, which is no place. 7-day bicycle races have actually occurred, of course, but all life is not in any literal sense a bicycle race. What Kaiser has found is a dramatic equivalent for a feeling about life, living as it is sensed, not seen. Samuel Beckett, an Irish writer living in France, has created an even more unreal stage than did such early expressionists as Kaiser in Waiting for Godot. Two characters spend the entire play waiting on a stage, empty of all objects but a stunted tree, for the arrival of someone who never comes. In fact, they are not sure of the name of the person they expect. They don't know whether he plans to come, and they are not even certain that he exists. A great deal of argument has raged over this play, but whatever else Godot may mean, clearly it gives concrete form to that inner sense of life in which the material world becomes unreal and living becomes only an anxious, uncertain wait for someone or something to save us from the bleakness of a meaningless existence. Ionesco's The Chairs, an expressionistic play, dramatizes man's frustrated desire to communicate to others anything that he learns about himself or about his life. An old man and his wife living alone on an island prepare a large party and hire an orator to tell the guests what the old man has learned about life. The couple believe that a number of guests arrive and they speak to them and provide chairs for each. But no guests actually appear, and the stage continues to fill with empty chairs. Later, the orator really does arrive, but he proves to be a deaf mute. The old man and his wife commit suicide shortly after this, and the orator then tries to communicate his message by writing on a blackboard. But all he produces is a meaningless scribble. Waiting for Godot and The Chairs are extreme examples of expressionism. They seem very strange to modern audiences brought up to expect that plays will be in large part realistic, but we should not think of an expressionistic play like The Chairs as fundamentally different from a realistic play like Hedda Gabler or a semi-realistic play like Hamlet. Each type of play presents characters who are images of man, and in each these characters are moved by one or two basic motives, which are expressed by their bodies, their clothes, their movements, and their words. In fact, while plays like Waiting for Godot and The Chairs may seem at first glance much more difficult than a play like Hedda Gabler, they are really much simpler and easier to understand. It takes a good deal of very careful reading to see that Hedda's motive is to seek freedom from all control. But it requires very little effort to see that the motive of the characters in Waiting for Godot is to wait for salvation. And the motive of the old man in The Chairs is to communicate what he knows to others. In expressionistic drama, everything is exaggerated and obvious once we adjust to the unfamiliar idiom. But in realistic drama, gesture and language are muted so that we are in danger of missing the meaning. No matter how much the characters of an expressionistic play may seem like a fantastic dream or how much the characters of a realistic play may seem like real people, in both cases, they are the playwright's images, definitions of man.
I come, Grey Malkin. Adult girls.
The world of the play. Every literary form uses certain essential means of expression, which a writer may exploit or enlarge upon in whatever manner he chooses, which he must continue to use so long as he wishes to work within the particular form he has chosen. The essentials of drama are only two: the actor and the stage. Anyone writing a play necessarily makes use of at least one actor, and he must also take into account the space around the actor, even if it be only a small plot of grass or two boards on trestles. No doubt you can think immediately of many borderline cases, perhaps puppet shows, in which the actors are only animated figures, or travel films. Movies are, after all, only a special kind of drama, which are nearly all stage. But the rule holds that drama uses actors of some kind in a stage of some kind. Abandon either, and you are no longer writing drama. We've already seen what the playwright does with his actors. He uses them as characters, images of man in his many aspects. In this section, we shall be concerned with what the playwright does with the space around his characters, how he uses it, enlarges it, until it comes to represent the world in which his characters live. In reading or seeing a play, our attention usually centers on character, and we sometimes pay too little attention to the setting, the scenery and furnishings placed on stage. It is enough, we feel, that the scenery and properties provide the characters with the objects necessary for the action, and a suitable background against which they can play out their parts. Ibsen in Hedda Gabler, for example, deals most immediately with life in Norway in the late 19th century, and appropriately enough, sets his play in a middle-class drawing room of that period, complete with furniture contemporary to it, stove, carpets, pictures. The set, looked at in this way, serves only to locate the play in time, and perhaps to contribute something to the mood. A tragic set is usually heavy and somber, a comic set light, airy, and gaily colored. But the care with which a dramatist like Ibsen sets his scene suggests that he makes use of it to supply more than the historical context or even the mood. The scene of Hedda Gabler is carefully described before the action begins. Ibsen prescribes the general style and coloring of the furniture, drapes, and carpets. He's explicit about the pieces to be used in the set and where they are to be placed on the stage, and he provides a detailed plan of the room, locating doors and windows, marking the existence of another small room to the back of the main one, designating a veranda beyond the glass doors. Nor does he forget his room arrangement during the course of the play. Not only are there carefully noted changes in the furniture, such as the removal of the old piano in the back room and the addition of a small writing desk, but the characters are always specifically placed in the set. For example, she forces Mrs. Elvsted to sit in the easy chair beside the stove, and seats herself on one of the footstools, or she goes out through the inner room to the left. Directions are always given in relation to the stage. Right is the right of an actor on stage facing the audience. A floor plan of the set for Hedda Gabler, marked with the movements of the characters. In the theater, this locating of characters on the stage is known as blocking. It makes it obvious that certain places or objects are associated with certain moods or conditions of the characters' minds. It is clear enough that Hedda brings out the pistols whenever she's frustrated and in a killing mood. It is less obvious, perhaps, that she goes to the stove to warm herself. She's an unusually cold woman. Only when she wants to hear the warming experiences of some other person, or that she goes to the glass doors and looks out only when she longs to escape the confinement of her life. Similarly, she moves into the small back room, which is peculiarly her own and which is dominated significantly by a portrait of her father, General Gabler, only when she is retreating into herself, withdrawing from circumstances that do not suit her and that she can no longer control. In this way, parts of the stage and the objects on it become associated with certain emotions and attitudes. A movement to one of these places, or the handling of a certain prop, gives a clue to what is occurring in the character's mind. Hedda's physical location often suggests her psychic or emotional location. The use of a physical set to make visible a state of mind is a common dramatic technique, and we must always look carefully for the relation between place and character. Ibsen is unusual in the exactitude with which he plans his settings and the care with which he moves his characters about. But all good dramatists have used their stage in this way to some degree. In Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, for example, after the conspirators have murdered Caesar, Brutus goes to the forum to explain to the citizens the necessity for the murder. His motives are lofty, and his address appeals to such lofty abstractions as patriotism, duty, and reason. His idealism is apparent enough from what he says, but Shakespeare underlines it by presenting it in visual as well as verbal terms. While the mob remains below, Brutus ascends the rostrum and speaks from above. In the Elizabethan theatre, for which the play was written, he probably went to the upper stage, a balcony above and at the rear of the main platform stage. After Brutus has finished, Mark Antony delivers a speech in which he fires the mob against the conspirators by appealing to their lower instincts, their greed, materialism, love of the sensational, and primitive delight in destruction. Antony begins on the rostrum above the crowd. As his appeals to baser emotions become cruder and more pronounced, he descends from the rostrum and mingles with them on the stage. So language, action, and scene have combined to express the difference between Brutus and Antony. While the meaning of certain places or objects to a character must often be sought out, dramatists frequently use scenes and objects that have immediately powerful symbolic values. To choose a few examples from Shakespeare, storm scenes, wild places such as the barren heaths in Macbeth and Lear, battle scenes composed of alarums and excursions, and savage woods suggest destruction, waste, and disorder. These qualities are often transferred to the characters placed in these scenes. An unnatural and disordered place can imply that the characters are in an unnatural and disordered state of mind. On the other hand, calm pastoral scenes, solemn social occasions such as feasts, marriages, and coronations, fertile gardens, and ordered domestic scenes can reflect characters in a state of harmony, productive order, and social concord. Certain objects, for example props, also have innate values. Pistols, for example, or a cross, a marriage ring, a crown, even a loaf of bread. But scenes and props don't always reflect character directly. A good man in a good setting, often they provide an illuminating contrast to the character by setting up an ironic perspective. A bad man in a good setting. The fresh romantic love of Romeo and Juliet and their exclusive concern for one another is mirrored perfectly by the walled, isolated garden of the Capulets, where they declare their love. But outside the walls of that enchanted moonlit place are the sun-baked square, the counting houses, and the graveyard of the city of Verona, where a deadly feud boils up. The realities of life, feuds, money, politics, death, stated by these other scenes, set off by contrast Romeo and Juliet's personal, private, and idealistic love. But whatever the manner in which a scene is related to a character, it usually provides some perspective on him. And the first question to be asked about any scene is how it helps to define the characters placed in it. Does it state their values in physical terms? Does it suggest contrasting values? While every effective dramatist uses his scene, at least in part, to tell us something about the characters he places in it, the scene has other functions to perform as well. The most important of these is to record in symbolic form the world that exists outside the individual, the scenes set in the pantry, the graveyard, the church, and the town square of Verona do not exist merely to provide an illuminating contrast to the ideal, impractical lovers, Romeo and Juliet. These city scenes represent the solid, objective world in which men have to eat, where they kill rather than love one another, and where in the end, they die. We can say then that as a general rule, the playwright uses his stage to represent the world in which his characters live. If the characters in a play are representations of human nature, of personality, the scene reflects the nature of the world, the environment of man. Besides being fundamental elements of the drama, personality and environment are the basic terms used in most philosophies and in most theories of history. At different times and in different places, men have believed that one or the other of these forces dominates human destiny. Christianity, for example, emphasizes character and assumes that man is free to achieve his own salvation with the grace of God, no matter what the condition of the world around him. The theory of evolution, on the other hand, assumes environment to be the crucial factor of life. The nature of a living thing is the result of its successful adaptation to the changing world in which it lives. In the Marxist view of history, man's personality is not determined so much by climatic conditions as by economic facts. Behavioralist psychology makes man little more than the product of external stimuli, to which he must respond in a mechanical fashion. Dramatists always reflect some prevalent worldview in their plays. The environmental determinists, for example, have had their exponents in the theater and the dramatic movement called naturalism. Naturalistic plays, as you might expect, show little interest in the complexities and depths of character. Instead, they emphasize the external world and the social conditions that are believed to shape human personality. Gerhard Hauptmann's The Weavers from 1892 is a naturalistic play on the revolt of the Silesian workers in 1844, when the steam-powered loom eliminated the jobs of the old hand-weavers. The play lacks a hero. Heroism is impossible when all actions are determined by environment. The characters are extremely simple, almost rudimentary versions of human beings, types rather than individuals. But the play details with elaborate care the economic facts of life, such as the rising cost of food, the operations of the new spinning mills, and the high tariffs, which force the manufacturers to turn to cheaper means of production. So important are the objective realities of life in this play that the dramatist specifies even the kind of bread eaten and the type of beer drunk, not because they contribute much to meaning, but simply because they help to suggest that environment, not man, is the fact of life. If the world is everything in a naturalistic play and character merely one of its effects, the reverse is true of expressionistic drama. Here the world is shown not as it objectively is, but as the man experiences it in his mind. In Waiting for Godot, for example, the real world of cities, factories, fields, and multitudes is dissolved into the subjective reality of a bare, nearly empty space, and the two men waiting. But naturalism and expressionism are extreme dramatic tendencies. The greater part of our drama has struck a balance somewhere between these two extremes by presenting both characters and the world. The mighty figures of Elizabethan drama reflect Renaissance optimism about the ability of man to shape himself and his world to a desired form. But these same outstretched heroes, as Hamlet calls them, are always placed squarely in a society and in a natural world that influence their actions and their ultimate ends. Modern dramatists have been vitally concerned with the possibility that the world controls man, but they have been equally aware that individual man still has special needs, unique values, and a will that drives him to struggle to achieve what he conceives of as his proper ends. Whatever the relative emphasis placed on world or character in a play, the world is usually one of the basic ingredients. Some brief explanations of how dramatists conceive of their theatrical worlds is necessary at this point. Just as stage characters are not total human beings but only dramatic representations of those motives that the dramatist considers the essential part of man, so the stage worlds he creates are not reproductions of everything in the real world, but symbolic renderings of what he thinks of as the essential qualities of our environment, human, social, or natural. Just as the dramatist thinks of man as a doer, as a power moving toward some fulfillment, so he thinks of the world not as a static object, but as a force exerting pressure in some direction. What we must look for in the world of a play is that force, or forces, expressed by the furniture, scenery, sounds, and words out of which a dramatist constructs his stage world. A further consideration of Hedda Gabler will illustrate one way in which a dramatist constructs his image of the world. The set is furnished in the formal middle-class fashion of the late 19th century. The pieces are heavy, dark, ornate, the hangings and rugs rich and somber. Furthermore, if all the furniture Ibsen stipulates in his stage directions were used in a production, most stages would be difficult to move about on. The actors would be forced to thread their way between pieces of furniture to get from place to place. This room, typical of the houses of the Victorian well-to-do, formal, rich, crowded, and dark, which Hedda further darkens by insisting that the curtains be closed against the sunlight, embodies 19th century middle-class society with its emphasis on propriety, restraint of emotion, and material wealth, with its constriction of free, natural movement, and with its insistence that pretenses be maintained. The set makes visible, as a painting might, the stodgy, deadening, constrictive society, the polite world into which Hedda has married, which exerts a powerful influence on her, and checks her free will. All dramatists objectify their concept of the world in the immediate sets of their plays, and we must be careful to note stage descriptions and all other references to the arrangement of the stage. The information about the world of Hedda Gabler provided in the dialogue is almost as important as the explicit directions to the stage manager. Tesman's inability to afford the house that Hedda demands and that Judge Breck furnishes reminds us that this is a world in which appearances are more important than truth. The fact that the limited, unimaginative Tesman can pay for his house and furnishings only if he wins the professorship from the undisciplined but creative Lovborg suggests that the kind of society represented by the set can survive only if vitality and imagination are suppressed. Ibsen's single scene, an interior realistically presented, is the usual way of setting the stage in the modern theater, which simply means that most modern plays present man in a limited social context. But this is only one of the many possible scenes, one of the nearly infinite number of worlds that can be created on the stage. If the play is set in a wild forest, or on a battlefield, or in a crowded tenement, its world is one of the primitive passions, rawness, and struggle. Set in a law court or place of government, it represents a man-made, orderly, traditional world. A stony wasteland suggests a hostile, ominous world, rich, fertile fields, a generous, burgeoning world. A consistently dark scene suggests a mysterious world filled with unknowns, while a brightly lighted scene suggests a reasonable, understandable world. Confining a play to a single scene creates a narrow, constricted world, while the presentation of a number of different scenes creates a varied, open world. An inside scene presents a man-made or social world, while an outdoor scene shows us a natural one. A bare stage implies a world in which all seemingly solid objects, buildings, mountains, trees, are no more than passing dreams. And if no attempt is made to disguise the working parts of the theater with wings and scenery, the implication is that all the world's a stage. It seems likely that even the physical details and structure of the theaters of a given period constitute an image of the world. Fortunately, playwrights are not limited to the use of the technical resources of the theater, such as lumber, canvas, paint, furniture, lights, in the construction of their dramatic worlds. Characters, too, can be employed as expressions of the play's world. Characters used in this way are really not personalities so much as they are parts of the scene, personified expressions of the elemental forces of the world. The witches in Macbeth are not individuals interesting in their own right, but aspects of a world shot through with dark, disorderly powers. The mob in Julius Caesar, and in other Shakespearean plays, is not properly understood as a collection of people, so much as a representation in human form of a senseless, directionless power, which is a crucial part of the world in which true characters like Brutus and Caesar have to live. Judge Bracken Hedda Gabler is little more than a personification of the social forces that constitute the immediate world in which the characters live. He is linked to the other expression of that world, the set. For it was he who selected the furnishings and arranged for the house, though Miss Tessman had to pay. Furthermore, Brack's title of judge, his conventional way of looking at everything, his formal dress on all occasions, and his intimate knowledge at all times of what people think, show that he, as much as the drawing room set, represents bourgeois values. Once we have identified a character with the world, it follows that all the components of his character, physical appearance, clothing, movements, thought, and style, will express the nature of that world. Characters of this type act out the world for us. They're not free agents, but simply manifestations of the scene. When Judge Brack, for example, argues with Hedda that she must conceal the fact that Lovborg was killed with her pistol, it becomes clear that this formal, carefully mannered society for which he speaks is more concerned with avoiding scandal than with being truthful. And when Hedda discovers that he is willing to suppress the facts in order to gain power over her, we learn not only that the law he represents is corrupt, but also, in his world, men may conceal the truth, not out of kindness, but because the threat of scandal can be held over the heads of those they wish to dominate. The judge's unmarried, childless state, his stag parties, his exceptional politeness and urbanity, his prosperity, all these facts provide insights into the society for which he is the spokesman. So far, we have concentrated on the visible means used to the playwright and enlarged upon the scene designer to create a world for the characters to move in. And considering the limited physical resources of the theater, particularly the Greek and Elizabethan theaters, which lacked artificial lights and had very little scenery, dramatists have by technical means achieved some remarkable effects and managed to present on the stage larger, more complex and mysterious worlds than would seem possible. The witches in Macbeth, for example, stirring their cauldron on a bare Elizabethan stage, must have evoked, then as now, a vision of a universe filled with dark primitive forces. The sentries in the opening scene of Hamlet peering out from the upper balcony of the Elizabethan stage and straining their eyes for a ghost to appear out of that area where the physical vision ceases to operate, evoke a world of vast, mysterious spaces about which man, who knows only the limited area of the castle behind the battlements, and that imperfectly, can only guess. While Yank dies below deck and Eugene O'Neill's bound east for Cardiff, the regular sounding of the ship's whistle as she moves through the fog creates an ominous world where man knows his direction only by instruments and where collision is an ever-present danger. The use of poetry, and specifically the use of metaphor, which is a prominent feature of that way of using language which we call poetry, permits the dramatist to construct a vast and full world with the utmost economy. The famous line spoken by Macbeth as he feels the emptiness of his life coming over him at the end of his play, "I begin to be a-weary of the sun," is a metaphorical way of saying, I'm tired of life. When Ibsen wishes to remind us of the sun shining bright and hot outside Hedda's dark room, he must arrange for her to see the sunlight pouring into the room, to register disapproval, and to have the drapes closed. In each case, the playwright wants to suggest that the sun is the source of life and growth in the natural world, from which his hero has cut himself off. Both techniques for bringing the sun in are effective, but Shakespeare's poetry gets the job done in a fraction of the time required by Ibsen. And because of this poetic economy, verse drama always makes the world of the play seem denser and more extensive, and therefore more actual, than does realistic prose drama. We can see the full value of poetry as a tool for constructing a dramatic world if we take such lines of poetry as the following and try to imagine what kind of dialogue or scenes the realistic prose dramatist would have to construct in order to build the same elements into his dramatic world. Here's Romeo speaking when he catches his first glimpse of Juliet on her balcony. "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun." Othello, as he looks at the sleeping Desdemona before he kills her, reflects, "But once put out thy light, thou cunning's pattern of excelling nature, I know not where is that Promethean heat that can thy light relume. When I have plucked the rose, I cannot give it vital growth again. It needs must wither." Hamlet expresses his disgust toward the world soon after Claudius has become king. "How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Fie on it, ah, fie! 'Tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely." Such passages demonstrate not only that poetry is more economical than prose, but that it permits associations to be made, which would be impossible, or nearly so, in realistic prose drama. So far, we have concentrated on the ways a dramatist constructs single scenes to image his world, but now we must consider other ways of handling scenes. Some plays offer a multiple world constructed from many different scenes. Julius Caesar, for example. There is a scene at Caesar's house in which Calpurnia warns him of her dream that he will be assassinated. There is a night scene in the city where lions roam the streets and strange fires appear in the heavens. There is Brutus's garden where the cloaked conspirators meet to plan the assassination of Caesar. There is the Senate chamber and its bloody murder. There's a short scene where the mob tears the poet Cinna to pieces because he bears the same name as one of the conspirators. And there's a battlefield where a series of accidents causes the defeat of Brutus and Cassius. On the surface, these scenes are all quite different, yet a close examination reveals the presence of each of a supernatural, mysterious, primitive force flooding through the world and affecting the lives of men. Taken together, these scenes, along with the others in the play, create a single world in which the irrational and inexplicable are manifested on many levels of being, in unnatural events in the cosmos, in the strange dreams and wild actions of men, and in the unforeseeable chances that shape history. Shakespeare has condensed the world of Julius Caesar to an essential force, and this force is shown to be not local and limited, but pervasive and universal. In a play made up of many scenes, we should first try to determine whether or not these scenes present different aspects of the same world and show the same force at work in different places, on different social levels, and on such different planes of existence as nature, society, history, and man. Worlds that question one another may be presented in sequence rather than simultaneously. Shakespeare is the master of this technique, and the alternation of city scenes with country scenes, indoor scenes with outdoor scenes, court scenes with tavern scenes is one of his trademarks. A good example occurs in his Henry V, where, on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, the English common soldiers facing death the next day gather in darkness around a small fire to talk of the plain realities of their world. The pain of dying, the wives and children left to starve, the sin of killing other men. The next scene shows the French nobles preparing for battle. There's a splendid chivalric world of glittering armor, brave banners, colorful clothing, and they talk of honor, courage, glory, and ransom. Scenic irony always raises the question of appearance and reality. If two or more opposing worlds are created in a play, which is the false image and which is the true? The answer will depend on what the playwright wants to say about the nature of things, and the only sure way of finding the answer is to look carefully at what happens in the play. In Henry V, the battlefield of Agincourt, covered with the bodies of French knights, slain by the arrows of soldiers who took war more seriously, blows away the wisps of French dreams of chivalry. One world drives out another, demonstrating its validity by continuing to exist when the other has vanished it. When more than one world is presented as a possible image of a man's environment, the progression of scenes, the unfolding of reality, is often important, and this unfolding usually shows the character's growth in understanding or illustrates the results that past actions have on their lives. The scene in Hedda Gabler is restricted to one narrow space, which tells us that no matter what has happened, Hedda continues to move within that stifling, restrictive society she and her age have considered the proper setting for man. What a different play it would be if at some point in the third or fourth act, Hedda were to rush out of the house into the streets of the town. In other plays in which characters do change and are forced to confront new experiences and do come to new understandings of the world, this developing knowledge is expressed in the changes of scene. For example, the opening scene of King Lear is a rich, well-ordered palace. Lear's mistake of giving up his rule and banishing his truthful daughter, Cordelia, has fearful consequences. The changes of scene within the play dramatize those consequences. Never again does Lear regain his palace or his earlier certainty. He's forced out into a bare heath in the middle of the night while the elements rage at him, and he can only conclude that man, far from being a king, is no more than a poor, bare, forked animal. He runs wild like a hunted beast through the fields, trying to elude his pursuers. He's cast into prison, and he ends his life on a desolate battlefield with all his daughters dead before him. His initial act forced him to move from a limited scene, which suggested that life was prosperous, orderly, and centered on man, to the bleak reality of a battlefield and the confrontation of a vast world extending through all time and space, in which man seems almost insignificant.
Fair is foul and foul is fair. Overthrew the rotten filthy air.
The world and expressionist drama. The scenes described in the previous section as examples of the ways in which playwrights construct their dramatic worlds are all realistic. That is, these scenes portray nothing that we might not see in real life. Interior settings such as that of Hedda Gabler may be more commonplace, more familiar than the bare, blasted heath on which Macbeth encounters the witches. But the latter is certainly not outside the range of what can be seen in nature. Even the witches are realistic if you believe in witches. But Shakespeare shows less concern for reproducing the familiar and unremarkable than does a modern playwright like Ibsen in his scenes. His images of the world tend to slip away from the strictly realistic toward the expressionistic. He is less concerned with making his stage world resemble everyday reality and more concerned with creating visual and verbal images that fully reveal the nature of the world. For example, in Timon of Athens, he sets the first half of the play in the house of the wealthy Timon, who loves all mankind and overwhelms his friends and acquaintances with gifts and feasting. When Timon discovers that his friends are false, and that his own wealth is exhausted, he turns into as great an enemy of mankind as he was once its friend. And he departs from the city into a desert where nature is grudging and brutal. There's nothing unrealistic about a great house or a desert. They can be seen every day. But it is quite clear from the way in which Shakespeare has juxtaposed these two places that he is not so concerned with presenting realistic scenes as he is with finding appropriate images for two types of worlds existing side by side: the rich and prosperous social setting which man creates for himself, and the harsh, isolated world of barren, hostile nature. Brecht's methods for creating the world in Mother Courage are closer to Shakespeare than to Ibsen's. While it is true that wagons, cannons, soldiers, battlefields, cook shacks, and cash boxes are all drawn from the real world, it is nonetheless startling to find our world represented as a continuous battlefield on which man must contrive to stay alive. Brecht's scenes are realistic enough in one sense. They do show aspects of what can be seen in reality, but they are unrealistic or expressionistic ultimately, since they portray the world as a never-ending war, which is not the literal truth. A number of modern dramatists have carried this technique a step further and have created scenes that bear little resemblance to what can be seen on Earth. Nevertheless, they register accurately and forcefully the nature of our environment as man apprehends it with his mind, not his senses. In Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, realism and expressionism are mixed. The salesman, Willy Loman, is crushed down by the weight of the world in which he lives. The set of the play represents this graphically by placing his house between two towering apartment buildings, which lean menacingly in a structurally impossible manner over it, and block the sunlight. The flimsiness of Willy's hope is made visible by the construction of his house. While the walls of the apartment houses seem to be solid, the walls of the Loman house consist of flimsy open framework. The furnishings, like the salesman's achievements, are few: a brass bed, a refrigerator, a silver trophy, and a few sticks of furniture. Other modern dramatists have made good use of similar sets to suggest the insubstantiality, the dreamlike quality of the material goods that man believes so solid and permanent. For example, in Thornton Wilder's The Skin of Our Teeth, a play celebrating man's indomitable will to survive and affirming those human virtues that make life worth living. The play centers in a house made of simple painted flats, which are knocked down the moment disaster strikes and restored the moment things improve. Our worldly goods, the play seems to say, are no more substantial than these canvas frames out of which this stage house is constructed. Human qualities are alone real and permanent. The use of expressionistic devices to portray the world is as old as the theater. In one of the earliest tragedies, Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, produced in Athens about 460 BC, the hero Prometheus is chained to a rock in the center of the stage throughout the play. He has been placed there by Zeus because he defied the god and brought fire to man, who, Zeus fears, may with the new power of fire challenge the rule of the gods. If one believes literally in the Greek gods, this is a realistic enough explanation of events. But the rock and the chains are principally a dramatic device for showing a hard world that resists and punishes any attempt to control and utilize for human purposes the gigantic powers, gods, in Aeschylus's terms, of the universe. In our time, we seem to be fixed and bound in an unexpected way by the realities consequent on our attempts to use the power of the atom. In recent times, we seem to have been fixed and bound in an unexpected way by the realities consequent on our times to use the power of the atom. Medieval drama was even more openly expressionistic. In medieval plays, the entire Christian world was often laid out schematically on the stage, often a town square, with no concern for the fact that this scene violated normal understanding of time and space. On one side was the mouth of hell, on the other the mountain of paradise and the Garden of Eden. In between was the field where Cain strikes Abel, Mount Ararat where the Ark of the Noah grounds, and Calvary where Christ dies, all represented symbolically and all in front of the still visible buildings of the town where Christians believe the sins and sufferings, the just acts and rewards dramatized in the Bible, were daily reenacted in contemporary costumes and accents. Expressionistic scenes are not therefore an unfamiliar dramatic technique for picturing the world. They are rather exaggerated uses of familiar techniques. A realistic author like Ibsen constructs a scene that is familiar in the extreme. a dark, sedate, middle-class room. And a modern stage designer is likely to make this set seem all the more real by providing it with solid walls that do not rattle when a door is slammed, with oil lamps that actually light, and with a stove that really burns. But however real the scene may appear, it is still an illusion. And its function in the play is not to reproduce a real room, but to symbolize visually and to define the bourgeois social world. It is an image, a metaphor, not a photograph of reality. The scene works the same way in the most extreme forms of expressionism, only all pretense of faithfulness to literal reality is abandoned. In Fernando Arabal's The Automobile Graveyard, the set of the play is a hotel constructed of old, abandoned, rusting automobiles, complete with a valet and a prostitute who kisses everyone goodnight. In Waiting for Godot, the natural world is reduced to a bare stage with one stunted tree, and the social world of rich and poor, owner and laborer, is represented by one vulgar, well-dressed man leading a ragged idiot along on a rope. And when the rich man sits down to a lunch of chicken, he tosses the bones to the idiot, who gratefully gnaws them. As strange and unacceptable as such worlds may seem to us, there is no difficulty in comprehending their meaning. In fact, it is a great deal easier to see how the automobile graveyard defines the world as grotesque luxury, living in the ugly waste created by an industrial society, than it is to see how the scene of Hedda Gabler defines middle-class society. We are likely to take the scene of the realistic play for granted, comfortably accepting it as no more than a picture of the everyday world. But the expressionist dramatist will not allow us to ignore the meaning of his scene. He insists upon it, and some familiarity with expressionistic drama will make us more alert and more sensitive to the worlds of realistic drama. Both use scenes for the same purpose, to represent the world as the dramatist apprehends it.
An enemy of Sir Ald's everywhere, if I do say so myself. But I never managed to be as remarkable as you, Emily, however hard I tried. You've been dead now 20 years. You died 2 years after we abolished slavery throughout the empire. But I wrestle with your black ghost still. I think about you, wonder about you.
Plot. For faith and philosophy are air, but events are brass. Amidst his grey philosophizings, life breaks upon a man like a morning. Herman Melville, Pierre. In these lines, Melville expresses the sense of life that is fundamental to the drama, that actions have consequences, that life is always in movement, and that the meaning of being only becomes apparent in events. Ophelia's plaintive cry in Hamlet, "Lord, we know what we are, but know not what we may be," expresses poignantly the painful knowledge that only in events can we truly discover ourselves. This view is not, of course, peculiar to the drama. Most forms of history, the theory of evolution, and philosophical dialectic, assume that life can be defined not by fine analysis of the single static object, but only by observation of the changes through which creation moves. The primacy of movement in the drama is reflected in all basic dramatic terms. The verbs to act and to perform mean not only to pretend, but also to do something. Drama derives from a Greek root, the verb drawn, meaning to do or to act. Play comes from the Old English plegan, which means, in one of its senses, to strive. Protagonist and antagonist, the technical names for the chief character and his opponent, mean literally the first struggler. For example, the principal character and the struggler against. The overall term for the movement in a play is, of course, the plot. Though the word originally had no connection with the concept of action, in modern English it may be used as a verb meaning to plan to achieve something. With this sense of the word, we can begin our discussion of the complex nature of plot. First, we must look for the origins of the forces that set the play in motion. The prime mover is usually some tendency inherent in one or both of the two constituents. First, we must look for the origins of the forces that set the play in motion. The prime mover is usually some tendency inherent in one or both of the two constituents of drama already discussed, in the world of the play or in the characters. When the world of the play, the environment has an important role. It will show a definite direction, a tendency to complete a pattern. In Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, Octavius Caesar describes the world's tendency as a constant ebbing and flowing movement, a ceaseless process of recurring change in which all life is caught up, going to and back, to rot itself with motion. This tendency is at work in everything in the play. Man, love, friendship, marriage, empire, and favor all move, change, dissolve, and ultimately become as indistinct as water is in water. The pressure of the world here is like the action of the sea upon the beach, consistent only in the destruction of existing shapes and the replacement of them with new shapes, which, in their turn, are washed away. The world of Mother Courage has a similar direction, though its changes are more brutal. Here the nature of the world leads toward an extinction of life, a slowing down of all moving things, the beat of the heart or the wheels of Mother Courage's wagon. The great world outside the doors of the Tesman house in Hedda Gabler lacks the single tendency of the worlds of Antony and Cleopatra and Mother Courage. Its vitality is random, a surging power, which at one moment throws up a mountain range, and at another brings a flower to bloom, which brings death to one person and life to another. It requires some care to discern the direction in which the world of a play is moving, for the actions in which its nature becomes manifest are not always conspicuous, and we often sense its presence before we know it. In Mother Courage, the efforts necessary to move the wagon suggest, for we do not actually see it, the enormous resistance of the world to all movement, and in Hedda Gabler, the clutter of furniture on stage, which makes free movement difficult, suggests that the social world the furniture represents is crowding in on life, channeling it into restrained and awkward movements. These single effects are not, fortunately, isolated expressions of the world's pressure. They join with other effects to form a larger, more definite pattern, which we must seek out. But the first step is to look closely at individual movements or counter-movements, for resistance to a force moving in one direction constitutes another force, which express the nature of the world. We can expect to find the world's motive expressed in such events as a storm at sea or the swing of a clock's pendulum, in the shape taken by a battle, and in the activities of those characters who do not move of their own volition. Whatever movement is not directed by the human will, in the splashing of rain on a window or in the gradual decay of a body, the world has traced its passage in matter. John Synge's Riders to the Sea is set inside a fisherman's hut on an Atlantic island. Throughout the play, the roar of the nearby sea can be heard, rising and falling as it smashes against the rocks of the coast and eats away at the land. During the play, news is brought to the hut of a succession of broken boats and drowned men. Now, eventually, the smashed body of the last man in the house is carried enwrapped in a sail, dripping with water from the sea in which he has just drowned. The sea, which represents the world, during the play, comes to have a monstrous, malevolent life of its own, and a will to smash and engulf all that is human and has shape. In Riders to the Sea, the principal motive force is the world. But in most plays, it is the characters with their motives that are the obvious prime movers. No matter how complex a dramatic character may be, all his nature is usually condensed into one or two fundamental desires toward which he moves. Mother Courage strives to protect her family and her life. The basic motive is visible in her shabby wagon, stocked somehow with shoddy goods, which she doggedly keeps moving across the stage by putting her children and herself between the shafts. Her feeling for life and her tough courage, which endured despite many defeats, also ring in her song. Christians awake, the winter's gone, the snows depart, the dead sleep on, and though you may not long survive, get out of bed and look alive. A character seems always to reach out, trying to realize in his actions and in his speeches the effect that it is his nature to want and to strive for. We become aware of Hedda's desire to be free from involvement, to remain her own possessor, by even such trivial events as her pulling herself out of Miss Tesman's embrace in Act 1, saying at the same time, "Oh, let me go." The same determination appears in her refusal to admit that she's pregnant and in her denial that her husband has any opportunities to see her unclothed. Later on, her attempts to defy restraint become more obvious and wilder as she urges Lovborg to debauchery and suicide to realize her own longing for an absolute nihilistic freedom, as she kills herself to escape Judge Brack. We have spoken so far as though the indication of a character's basic motive were a simple matter. In fact, a great deal of close attention to everything the character does is required to identify motive, because each new speech, each gesture in some way qualifies his motive. Often we can hope for only an approximation of the fundamental motive of a given character. In the greatest drama, such as Sophocles' Oedipus the King and Shakespeare's Hamlet, the playwright seems to have caught what we might call the human motive, the urgent need to perform some peculiarly human act, to realize in space and time some value that lies at the very root of the creature man and distinguishes him from the rest of creation. The perpetual fascination of these plays suggests that such is the case. But while we may feel that the fundamental human motive is successfully dramatized, it remains extraordinarily difficult to say with exactitude what it is. However, in Sophocles' Antigone, the basic motives, though ultimately quite subtle, stand out with a good deal of clarity. A character's motive is first expressed in a variety of seemingly irrelevant and unimportant details. A comment on the weather, a decision about entertaining, a reaction to an embrace or to the sunshine pouring into the room. The author usually concentrates a number of these details at the beginning of a play, so that in the first scene or two, we begin to get the feel of the characters and to identify their motives. This section of the play is usually called the exposition. By definition, a motive is the force that moves a person to seek the satisfaction of some need. Hunger is the motive forcing us to get out and seek food. A dramatic motive forces the character into the world where he can realize the goal his motive directs him toward. Hedda Gabler tries to control and destroy Eilert Lovborg. Mother Courage tries to keep her family together and her wagon moving. But as soon as this movement toward realization begins, it encounters an opposing force and conflict results. The part of the play in which the conflict occurs and is developed is known as the complication. The law that every body moving in one direction is opposed by a force exerted in another direction is as fundamental to the drama as it is to physics. That is to say, all drama turns on a conflict of some kind. If the character is complex, the opposing forces may be internal. Hedda Gabler is torn by her conflicting fear of scandal and her desire to live without restraint. Or the force opposing a character's realization of his motive may come from another character whose own motive causes him to move in a contrary direction. Hedda's desire to control Lovborg meets the counter-desire of Mrs. Elvsted, who wishes to protect him. Or the conflict may be between a character and the world, as Mother Courage's desire to protect herself and her children sets her in opposition to a world whose tendency is to bring life to a stop. In the greatest drama, conflicts usually occur on several levels, and each conflict mirrors the others. In Hedda Gabler, for example, we are first aware of a conflict within the character of Hedda herself between her excessive desire for respectability and her equally fierce desire for freedom. And this same struggle is projected outward in Hedda's efforts to control and use Eilert Lovborg. By listening to his tales about his wild life, by engaging in a carefully controlled flirtation with him, and by sending him out to commit violent acts, she achieves her freedom by proxy. Hedda is actually engaged in conflict with nearly every character in the play, with her husband, his aunt, and Judge Brack. They represent some repression of the free play of instinct, while she struggles for freedom from restraint. The same conflict appears in her struggle with society, represented by her house, by Judge Brack, and by the family into which she has married. She's also at odds with the long historical process, her husband's special subject, which bores her profoundly, but which has resulted in the civilization now represented by Tesman and Judge Brack. The play is not one, but a series of internal and external conflicts between two basic principles of life: freedom versus suppression, anarchy versus order, self versus society. To recapitulate, the basic forces at work within a play seek fulfillment. And as they do, they come into conflict. Out of this conflict, or more accurately, out of a series of conflicts, the plot emerges. It is necessary at this point to define just what we mean by plot. And this is a most difficult question, about which there is still no general agreement. Perhaps the most helpful way of approaching the problem is to distinguish plot from the motives of the characters and the pressure of the dramatic world in which they move. A character strives in one direction to achieve some particular goal, but his movements are deflected by some other force or forces, such as another character or society or the nature of reality or some countering motive within himself. The plot grows out of these conflicts, and we can think of it as a linear progression produced by, but differing in direction from, two or more forces moving in different directions. In some plays, of course, the character's motive and the plot are the same, or nearly the same. Every man sets out to find someone who will accompany him into the grave. For example, he seeks a power that will save his soul. And after several disappointments, he finds good works who goes with him to the place of judgment. What every man tries to do is in fact accomplished. The character's motive and the plot are nearly identical. In a naturalistic play, the direction in which the world moves will correspond to the plot. August Strindberg's The Father, for example, presents a world in which the stronger, more ruthless, and least complex survive by destroying the weaker who are unfit for some reason to endure the inevitable battle to the death. And this struggle is dramatized as a conflict between an intelligent, moral, and idealistic man and his cunning, self-satisfied, and relentless wife for control over their daughter. The survival of the fittest is the law that governs this world, and the end is inevitable. The wife keeps the daughter and arranges to have her husband declared insane. He is carried off in a straitjacket, still screaming protests, but his opposition to the world has not veered it from its inevitable course. The world makes the plot here. Events can only conform to the world's pre-established pattern. Character has little influence on the plot of any play that gives dramatic form to a closed system of belief. Plot, in plays of this type, will manifest the unimpeded operation of some natural or moral law. If plot is to be a useful tool for dramatic analysis, we must refine our definition. We can begin by sharpening the meaning of the word events. When we recount the story, the only events dealt with are the largest, the grossest of happenings. But is not Hedda's reaction to Miss Tesman's bonnet just as much an event as her suicide? A plot is actually constructed of a great many events, some ordinary and apparently trivial, others more unusual and obviously critical. If the play is artistically made, every event has meaning. We must accustom ourselves to thinking of the plot as the totality of events, not as a few crucial occurrences surrounded by a number of unimportant expository details. If we are to understand plot in its most significant sense, a continuous movement in a certain direction. This movement in a great play is as much present, though muted, in a movement about a room, the drawing of a shade, the theft of a pair of red boots, as it is in more spectacular events such as the burning of a manuscript or the destruction of a town. The larger events, the kind we select when telling the story, are the culmination of the smaller events that have preceded them. Firing the pistol at Judge Brack and burning Lovborg's manuscript are crucial events in Hedda Gabler. Anyone telling the story will probably include them, but these spectacularly destructive acts gain full meaning only when we realize that they serve to focus a number of Hedda's less obviously destructive acts, such as refusing to admit that she's pregnant, treating her husband and his aunt cruelly, rejecting the flowers, and insisting that Tesman's precarious financial and professional affairs are none of her concern. Plot, properly understood then, includes not only the major events, but all the actions and occurrences of the play. Ordinarily, a dramatist plots his way so that a number of these minor events build up to an explosive scene in which an obviously crucial event occurs. Ibsen is particularly regular in his use of this plot pattern. The movement in each of the 4 acts of Hedda Gabler builds from quiet, ordinary events at the beginning to some spectacular decision or violent action at the end. Just as each act moves from calm to crisis, so the crises of the 4 acts, taken together, form an ascending scale in which the crisis of each new act is more violent than that of the last, with the climax of the play, Hedda's suicide, coming at the very end. One school of dramatic criticism explains this pattern, which is a fairly common one, as the release and tightening of tension necessary to keep the spectacular interested. It may do this, but its most important function is to give concrete form to the playwright's sense of the characteristic movement of the affairs of men, long, slow periods, in which apparently nothing happens, suddenly culminate in a burst of action which releases the energy built up previously, just as the lightning releases in a flash in a slowly accumulated electrical charge. No matter what variations are made in this plot pattern, it remains essentially a cause and effect progression in which every event in the play results from the initial act. Given that act, the cause and effect type of plot requires that this event must follow. But it would be a mistake to assume that the cause and effect relationship is the only true plot pattern. It is the only claim Aristotle makes for it in the Poetics, the most suitable plot for tragedy. Tragedy assumes a world in which man makes a choice and abides by the inevitable consequences of that choice. Hedda Gabler puts the matter more simply. They say, as you make your bed, so you must lie. Tragic life is an iron chain of causation in which the characters can never escape the consequences of their acts, which are usually performed in ignorance of what their results will be. Comedy shows life from a different perspective and therefore makes use of a different type of plot. In comedy, character is neither so constant nor so important that it can determine the course of events. Men make foolish mistakes in comedy, and for a time it looks as if these mistakes will be fatal, but at the opportune moment, some stroke of good luck occurs, and all is well. A will is discovered revealing that the poor young man who loves the wealthy girl is really well-born and incredibly rich. A wealthy uncle, hitherto not heard from, returns to the country at the right moment to reward the virtuous nephew and punish the wicked one. or the wife and child, whom the tyrant thought he had killed in his jealousy 20 years before, miraculously turn out to have been saved. The world of comedy is filled with good fortune and unexpected surprise. Therefore, the comic plot shows sudden changes and effects that have no causes, at least no cause in what has gone before in the play. The introduction of some person from outside the play, or the use of some fortuitous happening to resolve the plot, is known as a deus ex machina, literally the god from the machine, referring to the occasional practice in the Greek theater of lowering a god onto the stage from a machine to settle the issues of the play. The point to be made is that there is no one right kind of plot, no type of relationship between events that is inherently superior to all other types. The dramatist connects the events that make up the play in the manner that will best reflect the relationship between events in the world as he understands it. Brecht's Mother Courage, for example, has an episodic plot, which is usually said, following Aristotle, to be an inferior type of plot arrangement. The more traditional plot arrangement is one in which X causes Y and Y leads inevitably to Z. The plot of Mother Courage might be described as X, 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 since no necessary relationship exists between events. The play consists of a series of scenes, each of which displays the same forces in conflict, the brutal world and the sharp-witted Mother Courage trying to preserve life and family. The scenes are related thematically, each one presenting a variation on the central theme of the play, but it cannot be said that the situation in Scene 10 is the result of what Mother Courage did in Scene 1. It might be argued that the plot develops, that it moves toward a climax, for the world grinds Mother Courage down, though it never defeats her, robbing her of one child after another until all are gone. But there's no climax in the ordinary sense, for there is no real change. At the end of the play, as at the beginning, the two ancient antagonists, the world and Mother Courage, destruction and creation, are left locked in a battle that will never cease. In this play, the episodic plot is not a failure, but a great success, for it shows consistently and perfectly Brecht's view of a world where there is no longer any necessary connection between events, only the certainty that the war in Sweden will occur again in Germany, in Poland, in Bohemia, that the army will always want the young men, that the rapist will always be waiting for the daughter, and that the wagon will always be hard to pull. The more traditional cause and effect plot, with its pattern of exposition, conflict, and climax, could not render Brecht's concept of the world as a place where the same struggle is always beginning again, and where men are not responsible for the situations in which they find themselves. What Shakespeare and other Elizabethan playwrights discovered was a new kind of plot unity, not the Aristotelian unity of a single chain of probable or necessary events, but a unity based on the principle of parallelism. Different kinds of people do the same things: plot a theft, prepare for war, hold a council. The single plot is duplicated and distributed to all levels of society. The values derived from this type of plot construction will depend on the skill and the interests of the particular playwright, but it will be useful to outline a few of the major possibilities. First of all,
the double plot has a potential for making universal the image of life presented in the play by extending its range of reference. The duplication of the same problems and the same patterns of events on two or more social levels suggests that these particular problems and patterns are common to all humanity, rather than peculiar to one person at one time. The double plot also allows the playwright to provide a perspective on his plots, or to suggest a complicated attitude toward them. To juxtapose a plot to overthrow a king with a plot to hold up some travelers on the highway is to suggest that the difference between usurpation and armed robbery is not so great as we might think. That the difference is one of degree, not of kind. But comments of this nature always work in both directions. If Falstaff's cynically realistic comments about the nature of war mock Hotspur's romanticism, then Hotspur's idealism, courage, and energy force us to question Falstaff's military prudence, his reduction of all life to a whole skin and a full. It may be a simple enough matter to see what really happens in Hedda Gabler. A woman destroys herself by cutting her ties with the world and with the rest of humanity. But in plays like Mother Courage, the plots often lead not to a flat definition of the meaning of a particular course of action, but to a sharply edged image of an abiding human problem that defies any easy solution. Are the bodies of Romeo and Juliet lying together in the gloomy tomb of the Capulets an image of triumph or defeat? Have they won a battle with life and made their love eternal? Or are they merely the pitiful victims of their own impetuousness and of the hatred that surrounds them? The play poses the question rather than answers it, suggesting that life, at least tragic life, is always double in nature, always a mystery, and that what we gain in one way, we must pay for in another. In summary, a plot is composed of a series of related events. These events are initiated by the characters trying to realize their motives, or by the world pressing in the direction which it is its nature to move in, or by some interaction of these forces. What happens in the play happens to the characters and to the world, and is manifested in their changed conditions and situations. But the dramatic focus is not finally on the characters of the world. It is on what happens, on the plot, on the fundamental pattern of movement and change, which is given substantial form by the events of the play. What the dramatist imitates, as Aristotle pointed out, is action, and the plot is his primary mode of imitation. Everything in a play exists to give form to the plot, and the plot in turn represents or imitates what a dramatist conceives as the recurring moment of life, and particularly human life in time.
What is there left to understand, my friend?
Why did you run away that day at Salomon's?
All of those years of my music. And you don't understand that?
All insulted your wife. You ran away like a coward.
Don't call my husband a coward. He is nothing of the sort.
Good evening, Mrs. Emily. It's a pleasure to see you again as well.
It's good to see you too, James. But I won't have my husband called a coward. What else could he have done? As a respected member of His Majesty's government.
Plot on the psychological level. Maurice Maeterlinck, in his The Tragedy of Daily Life, says, I have come to believe that an old man seated in his armchair, waiting quietly under the lamplight, listening without knowing it to all the eternal laws which reign about his house, interpreting without understanding it all that there is in the silence of doors and windows. I have come to believe that this motionless old man lived really a more profound, human, and universal life than the lover who strangles his mistress, the captain who gains a victory, or the husband who avenges his honor. In this passage and in his plays, the Belgian dramatist turns away from objective physical action, strangling a mistress, winning a victory, and focuses attention on subjective psychological action, listening, interpreting. For Maeterlinck, and for a great many modern dramatists, the most meaningful action occurs in the mind of man, not out in the visible, audible world of bodies, objects, and voices, W.B. Yeats puts the same idea into specifically dramatic form. After all, it's not the greatest play, not the play that gives a sensation of an external reality, but the play in which there is the greatest abundance of life itself, of the reality that is in our minds. But even if Maeterlinck and Yeats are right in claiming that true life is located within the mind, how can the movement of this life, its plot, be represented in the play, a form which by its very nature requires that everything be objectified in a physical set, in audible words, in visible movements, in clothing and in bodies? A novelist would have no difficulty at all in presenting the thoughts of an old man seated in his armchair, waiting quietly under the lamplight. But a play which consisted of only a man sitting motionless in a chair would convey next to nothing. The characters in a play, like real men, must find objective forms for what they wish to express. But their character is largely treated as if it were unchanging, as if a character continued throughout a play with exactly the same motives and exactly the same attitudes. In some plays this is nearly the case. Hedda Gabler has the same values and is trying to do the same thing at the beginning and at the end of the play. Nevertheless, it is impossible to think of her mind as static. Her motives remain the same. But she passes through these series of moods and mental states. On the other hand, Antigone and Creon, though they cannot escape the consequences of the train of action they set in motion with their initial acts, undergo radical changes of character during the course of the play. Since some dramatists try to show a psychological as well as an objective reality, and since the minds of their characters move from one condition to another, we can speak of psychological plots and try to describe their dynamics. Most major playwrights have been concerned, though not as exclusively as Maeterlinck and Yeats were, to find a way to present on stage the mental life of at least their major characters, and to record the changes in their minds. Macbeth, for example, has a striking objective plot composed of great battles, the murder of a king, the disruption of a kingdom, and the violent deaths of the usurper and his queen. Below this objective plot, and parallel to it, runs the psychological plot, the chain of mental events or conditions in Macbeth's mind. In the depths of his being, he is first courageous, simple, and loyal. He passes on to nervous indecision as ambition leads him to kill the king, and loyalty and reverence for human life cause him to recoil from the act. He nearly turns into a maniac as fear breaks his single state of man, and he begins to see visions. He hardens as he becomes accustomed to the business of killing all who threaten his rule. And finally, just before he dies fighting like an enraged animal, he changes to a walking ghost, a man for whom life has lost all meaning and has become no more than sound and fury signifying nothing. The plot of Macbeth's mind as he changes from a loyal and straightforward subject to an empty husk is as important to the play as what happens in the Kingdom of Scotland. However, the subjective and objective plots of Macbeth are not unrelated. They mirror one another in such a way that the events of one reflect the events of the other. As the first half-formed thoughts of ambition take shape in Macbeth's mind, they take shape physically in the form of witches who suddenly appear on the heath. As he destroys the ruling principles of loyalty and reverence for life in himself, so he kills his king. The hand and the heart go together. As his mind progresses from disorder to joylessness and hopelessness, so the country he rules is thrown into turmoil and becomes finally a wasteland. But the events of the physical plot do not exist here, as they would in an expressionistic play, merely to give objective form to Macbeth's mental processes. Scotland and the mind of Macbeth are equally real. And they parallel one another because the same principles are at work with the same effects in both. The forces that destroy a kingdom also destroy the little kingdom, man, in Shakespeare's coherent view of existence. Few playwrights have coordinated their physical and psychological plots so perfectly as Shakespeare did, but as a rule, the objective plot does double duty, at least in plays that have a psychological dimension. It records the changes that take place in the objective world and in the material condition of man, and it provides a rough parallel to what is taking place in the minds of the central characters. Once the fact is established that the objective plot reflects the subjective plot, we can begin to examine the way the subjective or psychological plot functions. It is composed and structured in the same manner as the external plot. Just as conflict results in the external, objective world from the collision of opposing forces, so certain forces within a person can cause internal or mental conflict. Hedda Gabler is both fascinated by freedom and afraid of it. Hamlet is torn by a longing to retire from the world, to escape the struggle with evil, and an equally powerful longing to be active and to bring about the needed changes in Denmark. Macbeth is torn between his ambition and his loyalty. The conflict causing psychological changes need not, however, be entirely internal. A change of mind may be brought about by a character's realization of what he has done or not done in the objective world. Creon's major change of mind occurs, for example, when he realizes that his course of action has destroyed his son and his wife. Once the conflict has begun, the psychological plot, made up of a series of mental events, is underway. We must watch for the way these mental events are related, just as we would in an objective plot, and we must look for the way in which changes come about. For example, the way changes occur in the psychological plots of Macbeth and Antigone differs considerably. Macbeth's progress from one mental state to another is a gradual and continuous movement toward a climax. The absolute emptiness expressed in the speech, beginning tomorrow and tomorrow. Antigone shifts abruptly. She appears during the first part of the play to be absolute for death and completely without fear. Suddenly, when she is condemned to be buried alive, the full significance of what she has done comes home to her. She prevents herself from becoming an hysterical girl at this point, but she is nonetheless radically changed. Sharp intrusions of truth, prepared for but coming suddenly, are called recognitions. If a character recognizes that the truth is quite the opposite of what he has previously believed to be the case, we have a reversal. Oedipus, for example, discovers that by his intelligence and skill, he has fulfilled, rather than evaded, the oracular prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. The reversal occurs when he learns these facts and is forced to see that he is not the greatest of men, but the weakest and most pitiable. Psychological plots can be arranged in as many ways as physical plots. The events of Macbeth's mind are connected in a cause and effect pattern because his ambition overcomes his care for human life. His own life becomes meaningless to him. Mother Courage does not undergo any development or change, except that her hope is perhaps dimmer by the end of the play. Her toughness, her common sense, her wit, and her courage are permanent parts of her mental makeup and can only be qualified or destroyed by death. Probably no psychological plot has so distressed the critics as the familiar comic plot, in which a character who has been consistently single-minded suddenly and without warning changes. This psychological version of the Deus ex machina is frequent in love comedy, a man and a woman, Beatrice and Benedict in Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, for example, who have previously hated one another, discover in a flash that they love one another. Shakespeare presents an elaborate form of this same change of mind in A Midsummer Night's Dream. The four lovers in the forest get incredibly mixed up as Puck's magic potion causes them to love where once they had hated. Such changes are often explained as mere devices used by the author to tie up his play without regard for credibility. But surely these psychological shifts, particularly when they involve love, are just as credible, as lifelike, as the relentless pattern along which Macbeth's mind moves. We all know that love is close to hate. And we can accept also what Shakespeare tells us in A Midsummer Night's Dream, that sudden love is a magical quality in man which transforms what was once hated into something desirable and lovely. We must try to approach psychological plots as well as physical plots without preconceptions about how the playwright ought to portray the workings of human nature. In his depiction of the process of mental change, he offers an image of the dynamics of the human mind, and we are likely to miss his point completely if we fail to take his plot seriously.
Sir Old could have had us arrested quite easily if he'd wanted. You know what it was like back in the 1800s. My husband had a family to support and a secure position in Cornwall with which to do so. I would not have allowed him to jeopardize that.
All right. But it's just...
Just what, my friend? You can ask me anything now, I'm dead. You can't offend an echo.
It's just that you're walking away from Sir Old like that. You're giving up on London so readily. I'm afraid it's somehow representative. I'm not sure how to explain myself, but sometimes I've felt you a hero.
Meaning. An explicit definition of meaning is more difficult because the word seems to invite circular definitions, such as meaning means to mean. It will therefore be useful to focus our discussion in this section on some of the ways in which a play means. Perhaps it will be helpful to think of the alternate ways in which the question, what does a play mean, can be phrased. What kind of knowledge does a play provide? What use does a play have? In what sense is a play true? Each of these questions really provides a definition of meaning, to provide knowledge, to be useful, to be true. But these words are nearly as ambiguous as meaning, and we shall have to be more specific. Many plays may be said to lack any important meaning. Most musical comedies, the standard television dramas, and all plays generally lumped together as entertainments have as their primary purpose the amusement of the audience. Such entertainments try to provide as much of what is immediately pleasing as possible. Pretty girls, elaborate sets, marvelous machines, amusing clowns, and heartwarming sentiments. We watch them, we seldom read them, only to pass a pleasant evening and to escape our own lives for a brief time. The general moral or theme, if there is one at all, is something banal, like love conquers all, or virtue is more important than gold in the long run. There are cynical banalities as well as optimistic ones. A corrupt society is responsible for all crime, or men are always selfish. And because these moral lessons are not grounded deeply in the characters or in the actions, and because their real implications are never explored, they gratify a simple appetite for uncomplicated and undemanding truisms. Nothing is more relaxing, after struggling with the complexities of life, than to be told that life is really all very simple and straightforward. At the next level are plays whose whole meaning is to give dramatic life to some specific person, historical event, or social condition. Sunrise at Campobello dramatizes Franklin Roosevelt's struggle to overcome the crippling effects of polio. Hateful of Rain makes clear the problems and agonies of the drug addict. The Far Country recreates Freud's treatment of the mentally sick and his first formulations of the principles of psychoanalysis. Such plays are not to be scorned as inferior substitutes for history, biography, or objective reporting. They do not merely make their subjects more vivid by acting them out before us, they actually convey additional information which other more factual treatments of the same subject are likely to omit. Instead of telling us, as a newspaper report might, that so many people are drug addicts, that a large percentage of addicts take up the habit because they are unable to cope with personal problems, and that the habit leads to crime, suffering, and death in a certain number of cases, a play about drug addiction such as Hatful of Rain will, in addition to providing factual information, attempt to show us the human facts. What does it mean to a real person, not an abstract statistic, to be unable to deal with life? What degradation does he suffer to satisfy his need for drugs? What breakdown of character results? Usually such plays contain either an implicit or explicit moral judgment and suggest some attitude or course of action that will help eliminate the problem. The general term for plays that dramatize specific personal or social situations and suggest a remedy is problem play. The meaning of such plays is the problem they present and the solution they propose. Interesting as that may be, problem plays fall short of greatness because their meaning has limited application. They deal with particular men in particular situations, not with man and the human condition. Plays that are great literature continue to entertain and to render in dramatic terms specific lives and social conditions. Antigone is a thrilling play by any standards. It contains enough violence and suspense to satisfy the crudest appetite, and it presents the crucial events in the life of a specific, though fictional, woman. It also dramatizes indirectly a social problem of a particular time, the dilemma of Athens in the middle of the 5th century BC, when she had grown to a great power in the Greek world and was discovering that practical politics do not always square with morality. Thus it would be possible, by giving it only a partial reading, to conclude that the play is an exciting entertainment, pitiful scenes in which lovers are separated, suspenseful conflicts between a young girl and a proud tyrant, and unusual punishments and cruel deaths. Or it could be read inadequately as a problem play, dealing with the Athenian political situation, which recommends a compromise between absolute nationalism and absolute morality, between the laws of men and the laws of the gods. But Antigone is more than an entertainment or a problem play. It is a dramatic presentation of at least one aspect of the human condition, as it always was and always will be. The demands of kings and the demands of the gods always seem to be at variance, just as the human body and the human spirit always seems to tug in opposite directions. Creon and Antigone are the voices of these eternal opposites, and their story illustrates the consequences, the meaning of choosing to follow exclusively one value or the other. The play, then, while it also presents a specific social and political problem in an entertaining manner, has a universal meaning. If we were asked to state the ultimate meaning of Antigone, it could only be stated in such universal terms as these. The human condition is one in which every good is strangely in conflict with some other good, and while it is necessary to choose one good and act upon it, this choice is always infinitely painful and destructive for the men involved. Any reading of the play, whether this one or another, will probably state in abstract language some general truth about the human condition. And since this is true, it appears that the greatest kind of drama has two dimensions simultaneously. It is specific in that it deals not with abstractions, but with particulars, a particular character, a definite setting, an action located in a specific time and place, and that it is universal in that its specific parts are arranged to show a crucial and enduring human situation. Much of the pleasure of a great play comes from the vividness with which specific characters taking part in definite events are embodied on the stage. That mankind is infinitely durable and quick-witted, even in the most desperate circumstances, is a truism that is not likely to arouse much interest or enthusiasm. But Mother Courage providing for her children by pulling her wagon from town to sell her wares to the soldiers is extremely moving. A sermon about our need for other people is not clearly so compelling as seeing a particular woman, Hedda Gabler, refusing to acknowledge that she is pregnant, handling her pistols, shutting out the sunlight, treating her family in a politely savage manner, and pacing back and forth between the walls of her dark, unencumbered room. How meaningless a philosophical discussion about the conflict of duty to the state and moral duty seems compared with watching Antigone and Creon hurl words at one another. The fact that the characters and the other details of a drama are not real in any absolute sense does not prevent the dramatist from giving us the illusion of intense actual life. Dramatic characters may be merely collections of traits, embodiments of a few ideas expressed in a few actions and words, but they often seem to have a heightened, intensified vitality. Here's one way in which a play means. It creates existence on the most immediate and personal level, and it deals with the solid facts of life, the emotions of love and hate, the terror of death, the conviction of pride, the persistence of living things. In this sense, the meaning of Romeo's love or Hamlet's despair is the fullness, the power, the truth with which they are realized in words and acts. A poem, says Archibald MacLeish in Ars Poetica, should not mean but be, but fully realized being, the dramatist has always insisted is one kind of meaning. Philosophy, science, theology, statistics, these all make statements about reality in abstract terms, such as the good, the true, the one, or the norm. But the arts, drama included, make their statements in specific terms. Hamlet, Claudius, Elsinore, the ghost, the stabbing of Polonius. Meaning in the drama must grow out of particular events, must be built on the facts of human nature, and must show a man living and experiencing the world immediately and intensely. As we have seen, however, great drama also has a universal meaning. Antigone is not only a strong-willed human who obeys the laws of the gods, rather than the law of the ruler of Thebes, and buries Polynices, but she is also the representative image of the power of the human spirit, which disdains practicalities and refuses compromises. What in a play permits us to extend its meaning from a powerful creation of a human experience to a picture of general human nature, as true for us as for those who saw its first performance? First of all, a play's universality of meaning depends to some extent on the kind of experience portrayed and on the power and accuracy with which it is brought to life. If the drama creates a convincing image of some primary human situation or attitude, love, for example, or the difficulty of communication with other people, loneliness and fear of death, the conflict of fate and free will, or the relationship of man and woman, then its bearing on all men will be apparent. The audience will recognize itself in whatever figures the dramatist uses, because its members have experienced in some degree the same passions, hopes, and conflicts to which the actors give voice and body. It was once believed that only a great action like the struggle for a kingdom involving great heroes such as kings and queens could serve as the subjects of great drama. We now know that it is not the apparent grandeur of the play's subject that bestows importance on it, but the fact that it depicts powerfully and truthfully some eternal aspect of the human condition. A salesman can face the same overwhelming questions and the same terrors that the Prince of Denmark can, though the fact that he is a salesman, not a prince, suggests that he will have less success in answering his questions, and that his failure or his achievement will have less impact on the world at large. we must always remember that it is not the apparent subject matter, but the accurate and vivid presentation of some crucial human problem that enlarges the play's range of meaning. Thus, the action of a woman trying to give a successful garden party may be very important because it embodies a characteristic human attempt to create by means of tact, graciousness, and planning an ordered and mutually satisfying relationship between human beings. While a play about the fall of kingdoms, in which such subjects as free will, honor, and death are openly and frequently discussed, may be no more than philosophical horse opera. Hamlet sums up very nicely the necessity for presenting true images of men on stage. The purpose of playing was and is to hold as 'twere the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her own feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time his form and pressure. Now this overdone or come tardy off, though it may make the unskilful laugh, cannot but make the judicious grieve. Oh, there be players that neither having the accent of Christians, nor the gait of Christian, pagan, nor man, have so strutted and bellowed, that I have thought some of nature's journeymen had made men, and not made them well. They imitated humanity so abominably. As we read a play of the first rank, we gradually become aware of emerging patterns. We begin to sense the relationship between apparently diverse events. Characters come into focus as we see that each is not a collection of disparate traits, but a unity in which clothing, physical appearance, peculiarities of speech, movements, gestures, and dominant interests all help make up the essential pattern. The furniture on the stage, the arrangement of the props, the decor, the references to a world just beyond the stage, coalesce to suggest some one force or recurring conflict. We discover a central power moving through the plays as we observe that events have a characteristic direction, that apparently trivial events manifest the same struggle between the same forces as do the obviously crucial confrontations, and that again and again the same order of consequence results from the same kind of cause. Ultimately, if we read the play well, it becomes apparent that all the components, characters, world, and plot, are not only unified within themselves, but comprise a total unity, a coherent image of man and his world in movement. As we become aware that the parts of a play are closely related to each other, we begin to understand its universal implications. Everything Hedda Gabler does manifests what we have called a drive toward freedom, an attempt to escape all restraints. This drive always encounters an opposing power in some form, which seeks to enclose her and limit her actions. Thus it becomes obvious that this particular woman, in this particular setting, is but one instance, a late 19th century version, of a universal struggle between man's desire to be absolutely anarchically free and the bonds imposed on him by his own nature, by other people, and by social arrangements. By structuring the parts of the play, the dramatist transforms his particular rendering of life into a statement of a universal. In one sense, this universal is the meaning of the play. A statement of the meaning in this sense, however, is no substitute for the play. Our task as critics is not to boil the play down to a general statement about life. While it is necessary to search for the ultimate unity of the play, and while some brief statement of the nature of that unity will be critically useful, no such statement does justice to the full meaning of the play. To say that Hedda Gabler is a dramatization of the struggle between freedom and restraint, or that Mother Courage shows the determination and magnificence of humanity in a hostile world, or that Antigone reveals the inevitable conflict of body and spirit, or of individual and political morality, is not really to state adequately what these plays mean. to be understandable, to be fully meaningful, these statements require a full knowledge of all the specific details in the plays, for these details are necessary qualifications and refinements, the modifiers and subordinate clauses, as it were, of the general idea. Antigone's haughtiness, her scorn for weaker people such as her sister, and her monumental certainty that she alone is right, are all as integral to Sophocles' dramatic definition of man's tragic situation as is the general idea that emerges from the particulars of the play, that life is a conflict between equally necessary moral and practical values. We cannot, therefore, discard either the specific details or the central idea of the play in seeking its meaning, for each depends on the other for its full meaning. Or rather, meaning grows from an interaction of detail and general theme. The great dramatists work with severe economy, wasting neither word nor gesture. If what they have to say about life could be reduced to some such simple phrases as those given above, there would be no point in writing plays. A single sentence would suffice. The dramatist may extend the universal implications of his image of life in several ways. All of these may be regarded as aspects of structure, but it will be helpful to examine a few of them separately. In the discussion of plot, we notice that the device of the double or multiple plot tends to expand the meaning of the play. If we observe the same events, the same problems, the same human actions occurring in more than one life, in more than one place, the implication is that this is not a unique but a common pattern of life. W.B. Yeats referred to this effect as the emotion of multitude and illustrated it in this way. The Shakespearean drama gets the emotion of multitude out of the subplot, which copies the main plot, much as a shadow upon the wall copies one's body in the firelight. We think of King Lear less as the history of one man and his sorrows than as the history of a whole evil time. Lear's shadow is in Gloucester, who also has ungrateful children, and the mind goes on imagining other shadows, shadow beyond shadow, till it has pictured the world. A few of the dramatist's major techniques for expanding the meaning of his image of life and making it universal are double plot, perspective, analog, symbol, and image pattern. These are all different aspects of what we generally term imagery. This word is ordinarily used in a limited sense to refer to comparisons in which one thing is said to be like another thing. The chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble, or in which one thing is said to be another thing. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. In these examples of simile and metaphor, two varieties of imagery, meaning is achieved by yoking one thing with some other thing that it resembles, or with which, according to the poetic statement, it is identical. The dramatist uses this same process more elaborately when he establishes meaning by paralleling his main action with imagery patterns, extended symbols, and multiple plots. Ultimately, the artifice of the entire play may itself profitably be considered a complex image. Every serious dramatist is saying, in effect, life is like this play. Two fundamentals emerge from our brief discussion of the drama. And if you can make them basic to your way of thinking about the drama, you will find that the details and complexities of any given play will be readily understandable. First, a good play presents the playwright's vision of what life is. From this, it follows that every part of an artistically successful play is significant, and we cannot pass over any detail. The coloring of a character's hair, the placement of a piece of furniture, the most seemingly casual remark or gesture, as mere realistic stuffing. The irrelevant is omitted. Only the relevant is present. Second, insofar as a play is a work of art, all its parts are related. When we ask the significance of any one part, we must ask how it is related to the other parts. We must discover not only how the components of a character form a unity, but how that character is related to the scene in which he is placed and to the other characters around him. The key to reading any play is to think of it not as photography or as life, but as art, as a heightened and structured image of man and his world in movement.